The drink hit Daniel Brooks square in the chest before he even saw it coming. Cold, deliberate, in front of everyone. Sergeant Victor Hayes set the empty glass down, slowly smiled, and said loud enough for the whole room to hear, "Careful repair guy, this ain't the place for people like you." The room went silent. Every soldier waited, and Daniel Brooks, a quiet single father who hadn't thrown a punch in 4 years, simply looked at Victor with eyes so calm, so still, it made the air feel dangerous. Nobody knew why. Not yet. Drop a comment with your city. I want to see how far this story travels, and if it hits you the way I think it will, subscribe, because this one's just getting started. The dinner had started quietly enough. Fort Calloway held its annual military appreciation banquet every October, a tradition that brought together active duty personnel, civilian contractors, support staff, and a handful of local veterans from the surrounding county. The main hall of the officers' recreation building had been cleared of its usual furniture and replaced with long folding tables, white tablecloths that didn't quite reach the floor, and centerpieces made of small American flags stuck into foam blocks that someone had spray-painted gold. It was the kind of event that looked more impressive in the base newsletter photos than it did in real life. Daniel Brooks had almost not come. He had stood in his small bathroom that evening, staring at the one dress shirt he owned that didn't have a stain on the collar, and thought seriously about calling in sick. Not because he was actually sick, but because he had learned in the 14 months he'd worked at Fort Calloway as a civilian maintenance supervisor that events like these had a way of reminding him exactly where he stood in the order of things. Not on the inside, not quite on the outside. Somewhere in the middle, like a piece of furniture that people walked past without seeing. He had ironed the shirt anyway. He had done it for the same reason he did most things these days, because his daughter was watching. Emma was 8 years old, with her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness, and she had been sitting on the edge of his bed, doing her homework while he got dressed. "You look good, Daddy," she had said without looking up from her math worksheet. "You didn't even look." "I don't have to look, I already know." He had laughed at that. Actually laughed, the kind of laugh that loosens something in your chest you didn't realize had been tight. He had kissed the top of her head, told Mrs. Garner next door to call him if anything came up, and driven to the base in his 2009 Ford pickup with a cracked dashboard and a heater that only worked on the driver's side. The parking lot had already been full when he arrived. He had found a spot near the back fence and walked in alone. The first person he saw inside was Corporal Luis Reyes, who worked in the motor pool and had a habit of waving at everyone the way golden retrievers greet strangers with total unconditional enthusiasm. "Brooks, you made it, man." Reyes grabbed his hand and shook it like they hadn't seen each other 3 hours ago. "I told Martinez you were coming, and he bet me $5 you wouldn't show." "Tell Martinez he owes you $5. Reyes grinned. "You want a drink? They got the good punch tonight." "Well, it's the same punch as last year, but Sergeant Kim put something in it, so now it actually tastes like something." "I'm good for now." Daniel found a spot near the far end of one of the tables, close enough to be present and far enough to be mostly invisible. That was the science of it. You attended. You showed face. You didn't make yourself the center of anything. And at the end of the night you went home. How was good at this? He had become very good at this. He was watching 2 younger enlisted guys argue about a football game when he first noticed Victor Hayes working the room. Sergeant First Class Victor Hayes was exactly the kind of man who made an entrance even when he was just walking across a carpeted room. How was built like someone who had never once allowed himself to be uncomfortable, broad across the shoulders. Chest always pushed slightly forward. Jaw always set at an angle that suggested he had already decided he was the most important person present. He wore his dress uniform like armor, every ribbon and badge polished to the point where they caught the light when he moved. He was surrounded as always by a small cluster of younger soldiers who orbited him the way nervous planets orbit a star, close enough to benefit from the gravity, far enough to stay out of the blast radius. Daniel had been aware of Victor Hayes since his 3rd week on base, not because Victor had done anything specific to him at first, but because Daniel had spent enough years in environments where identifying the most dangerous personality in the room wasn't a skill, it was survival. And Victor Hayes had a particular kind of danger that Daniel recognized immediately. Not physical, Not tactical, social. Victor was the kind of man who used rank the way other men used fists. He didn't need to hit you to hurt you. He just needed an audience. Daniel had watched him operate on other people for months. The way he'd cut off a civilian contractor mid-sentence and then turn to the soldiers around him with a look that said, "Can you believe this guy?" The way he'd give a compliment so wrapped in condescension, it was hard to know until 30 seconds later that you'd actually just been insulted. The way he made the maintenance crew feel like furniture necessary enough to keep around, invisible enough to ignore. Daniel had kept his distance. It had worked for 14 months. It stopped working tonight. I didn't see it coming because he wasn't watching Victor. He was listening to Sergeant Kim tell a story about a training exercise gone wrong. Something about a supply truck, a wrong turn, and 17 miles of Louisiana swamp when the cold hit him. It was immediate, shocking. He felt the liquid spread across his chest before he understood what had happened, soaking through his dress shirt, through his undershirt, running cold against his skin. He stood up from his chair by instinct, and there was Victor Hayes standing 2 feet away, empty glass in hand, with a smile on his face that wasn't quite a smile, more like the expression of a man who had decided to prove something and was pleased with the result. The whole section of the table had gone still. Kim stopped talking mid-sentence. Reyes, 6 seats down, turned around. "My apologies," Victor said in a tone that contained no apology whatsoever. "Didn't see you there." He set the glass down on the table. "Easy to miss, I guess. Blends right in." He said it to Daniel, but his eyes swept the table, making sure everyone was watching. "That's what happens." Victor continued loudly enough for the surrounding tables to hear, "When people forget where they belong. You're in the flow of traffic. You're gonna get bumped." He looked at Daniel's soaked shirt. "Might want to go get cleaned up. The commissary's still open. Maybe they got a mop for you." 2 of Victor's guys laughed. Not all of them, but 2, and Daniel felt something move through him. Not rage, not humiliation, not the specific kind of burning shame that Victor was clearly going for. Something older than that. Something that lived deeper. He'd felt it in places most people in this room couldn't imagine. He recognized it for what it was. Threat assessment. His mind had already done it in the half-second between the drink hitting his chest and his eyes finding Victor's face. Distance, position, exits, weight distribution. The 2 guys who laughed were to his left. Victor's dominant hand was his right. There was a table between them. Nothing he couldn't move through in 2 steps if he chose to. He didn't choose to. He reached down, picked up his own glass from the table, set it precisely at the center of his placement like someone setting down a chess piece. Then he looked at Victor, just looked at him. The smile on Victor's face flickered. Just for a moment. Just a fraction. Because there was something in Daniel's eyes that was very hard to explain. It wasn't anger. It wasn't fear. It wasn't even the forced calm of a man holding himself back. It was the calm of a man who had already been through worse, much worse, and had nothing left to prove to anyone in this room. "I appreciate the apology," Daniel said. Quiet, level. He didn't look away. He said it once. Then he picked up his jacket from the back of his chair, nodded to Sergeant Kim, who was still frozen mid-story, and walked toward the exit with the same unhurried stride he used to walk across every job site he'd ever worked. Like he had all the time in the world, like nothing that had just happened could touch him. Outside. The October air was cold and clean, and Daniel stood in the parking lot for a moment with his jacket on over the wet shirt and his eyes closed. He wasn't meditating. He wasn't calming himself down. He was just listening to the silence. After years in environments where silence meant something was wrong, he had learned to treat it as a gift. He heard footsteps behind him. "Hey!" It was Sergeant Kim. She'd followed him out. A compact Korean-American woman in her 30s with a dry sense of humor and the kind of situational awareness that made Daniel privately think she'd have made a good operator. "You okay?" "Fine." That was a really specific kind of fine. He almost smiled. "Go back inside, Kim." "I don't want to go back inside. Hayes is in there being insufferable, and the punch is getting warm." She fell into step beside him, though he wasn't walking anywhere. "For the record, Every person at that table knew what just happened, and not one of them thought it was funny. Reyes looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. Reyes always looks like that when Hayes is around. She paused. You know, most people would have said something, or done something. I know. Why didn't you? Daniel looked out at the parking lot. The row of military vehicles. The flag at the edge of the lot lit from below, moving barely in the wind. Because it wouldn't have helped anything, he said. It might have helped your dignity. My dignity's fine. He said it simply without defensiveness. Hayes wanted a reaction. He wanted me angry, or embarrassed, or scared. Any of those would have made him bigger. He put his hands in his jacket pockets. I'm not in the business of making men like that bigger. Kim was quiet for a moment. Where'd you come from, Brooks? She finally asked. Before here, before Calloway. The question landed differently than she intended. He felt it the way you feel a pressure change in the air before weather. Different places, he said. She waited. The way people wait when they know there's more. He didn't give her more. I should head home, he said. My daughter goes to bed at 9. I like to call and tell her good night if I'm not there. Kim looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. Okay. She started to turn back. Hey, Brooks? He looked back. Whatever you used to be, she said quietly. I don't know, but what you are now. The guys inside could learn something from it. She went back in. Daniel stood alone for a moment longer. Then he walked to his truck, started the engine, and drove home to tell his daughter good night. Emma answered on the second ring. I thought you were staying for the whole thing, she said. It ended early. Did something happen? Nothing worth talking about. That means something happened. He was at a red light. He looked at the signal, the amber glow of it, and thought about how to explain to an 8-year-old the complicated way that some men measure their own height by pushing other men down. There was a guy who was rude to me, he said. What kind of rude? The kind where he wanted everyone to see him do it. A pause. He could hear her thinking. Emma was a serious thinker. She got that from him. Did you get mad? She asked. A little, inside. But you didn't show it. No. Why not? He let out a slow breath. Because when someone does something like that, they're hoping you'll lose control. They're hoping you'll give them something to use. The moment you lose your temper, they've won. Because now the story isn't about what they did. It's about how you reacted. Another long pause. That sounds really hard, Emma said. It is, but it gets easier. Is that why you always say be water? He felt something move through him. Warm. Yeah, baby, that's why. Okay. He heard her settle into her pillow. Daddy. Yeah. You're the strongest person I know, and not like muscles strong, like the other kind. He pulled into the driveway and sat in the dark for a moment. Get some sleep, he said. Already am, she said, half asleep. He sat there until the call ended. Back inside the banquet hall. Victor Hayes was still holding court. He had moved on to a different story, something about a training rotation in Nevada, but the drink incident was still alive in the room, the way a smell lingers after the source is gone. Reyes was nursing his punch quieter than usual. Two of the other maintenance crew guys, Rivera and Cho, had stepped away from the table and were talking near the wall. Did you see his face? Rivera said quietly. Hayes's face, I mean. When Brooks just looked at him like that. Yeah. Cho nodded. Like Hayes was, I don't know, nothing. Like he was just nothing. Brooks didn't even blink. I blinked, Rivera admitted. I blinked like 6 times. You think Hayes knew what he was doing, like targeting Brooks specifically? Cho shrugged. Hayes always knows what he's doing. That's what makes him... He stopped. Anyway, I've seen guys react to Hayes before. Get defensive or start talking back or just fold completely. Brooks was... different. Different how? Like he wasn't scared, but not because he was trying to be brave. Cho thought about it. Like he was just done being scared. Like he ran out of it a long time ago. They both looked across the room to where Hayes was laughing loudly at his own punchline. "I want to know his story," Rivera said. "Who Hayes?" "No, Brooks." Across the base in a gray-painted apartment in the civilian housing row that was newer than most of the base, but still felt temporary. Daniel Brooks sat at the small kitchen table with a cup of coffee. He wasn't really drinking. He'd changed out of the wet shirt. He'd folded it and put it in the laundry basket with a kind of deliberate care, the way he did most things now. Not because the task demanded precision, but because precision had become a way of being present. A way of not letting the mind run to places it didn't need to go. On the table in front of him was Emma's latest school project, half finished. She was doing a report on World War II veterans for her social studies class. The paper was decorated with her handwriting. Big looping letters that still hadn't fully settled into the disciplined small print that would come later. There were sticky notes on it. Questions she'd written to herself. Why did they come home different? What does it mean to be brave if you're also scared? Can someone be a hero and still be regular? He looked at that last one for a long time. Can someone be a hero and still be regular? He got up, rinsed the coffee cup, and went to bed. He didn't think about Victor Hayes. That was the part that would have surprised Victor most if he'd known. Because Victor Hayes was the kind of man who assumed that when he did something, it stayed in the minds of the people he'd done it to. He assumed the drink on Daniel's shirt was replaying on a loop somewhere, the humiliation fresh, the wound open, the sting still stinging. But Daniel Brooks had been trained by people who made Victor Hayes look like a parking lot argument. He had been put under pressures that would have destroyed most men. He had operated in silence and darkness in places where a wrong breath could end everything. And he had done it not by being fearless, but by learning to carry fear in a smaller pocket. You folded it up small. You put it somewhere you could reach it without drowning in it. And then you did your job. He had learned that lesson in water so cold, it stopped feeling cold. He had learned it on nights when the stars weren't visible, and the only thing telling him where he was the sound of another man's breathing next to him. He had learned it in the space between a decision and a consequence where everything real about a person gets sorted out fast. He wasn't those places anymore. He was Fort Calloway. He was a maintenance schedule. He was Emma's Tuesday soccer practice and the loose hinge on her bedroom door he kept meaning to fix. He was regular, and that was not a small thing. That was, in fact, the thing he had chosen. The next morning, he was on site at 0630. The motor pool generator had been throwing a diagnostic code for 3 days, and the scheduled rotation of equipment meant it needed to be addressed before 0800, or the whole morning's training cycle would be delayed. Daniel had already pulled the maintenance records the night before the banquet actually, and he had a theory about the fault code that no one else had thought to check. He was wrong about 2 things and right about 1. The 2 things he was wrong about were fixable. He found the actual fault within 40 minutes, a corroded sensor coupling that looked fine on the surface and wasn't fine at all. He had a replacement in the parts cabinet and had it installed and calibrated by 0743. He was clearing his tools when Corporal Reyes came into the motor pool, looking like he hadn't fully recovered from the night before. "You're here early," Reyes said. "Generator was down." "Right." Reyes lingered, which was unusual for him. Reyes was a man who moved constantly, always somewhere to be, always in the middle of something. Standing still didn't suit him. "Hey, listen, about last night." "Don't." "I just want to say, Reyes." Daniel closed the tool case. "I know what you're going to say, and I appreciate it, but I don't need it." Reyes looked frustrated, like a man who has an apology ready and isn't being allowed to give it. "I should have said something. When Hayes did that, it happened fast and You didn't do anything wrong." "I didn't do anything at all." Daniel picked up the tool case and looked at Reyes directly. The younger man looked genuinely uncomfortable, not with guilt exactly, but with something close to it. The particular discomfort of having witnessed something wrong and having stayed still. "Here's what I want you to hear," Daniel said, jumping in right then, in front of Hayes's crew, in front of everyone. That might have felt good for 30 seconds, but Hayes would have used it. Against you, against me, against the dynamic in that room for the next 6 months. Sometimes the best response isn't the most immediate one. Reyes stared at him. You sound like you've thought about this before. I have. Specifically. In general. Reyes opened his mouth, closed it. Then, has anyone ever told you that you're kind of a mystery? Daniel almost smiled. My daughter tells me I'm boring. Your daughter is 8. She's very perceptive. Word got around as it always does on a military base. By the end of the day, most of the maintenance section knew what had happened at the banquet. By the following morning, it had spread into the motor pool, the supply depot, and the East Range support team. The story changed in small ways as it traveled. The details shifted, the emphasis moved, but the core of it stayed the same. Hayes humiliated Brooks, and Brooks just stood there. The interpretations split exactly the way Daniel had known they would. Some people heard it as a story about weakness. A civilian who couldn't stand up for himself. A maintenance worker who knew his place. Others heard something different. Sergeant First Class Ramirez, who ran the East Range, had been at the banquet. She had seen Daniel's face in that moment, and she told it differently when people asked her. I wasn't scared, she said. That's what got me. Most people, when Hayes does something like that, you see it on their face. The embarrassment, the anger, the scramble to figure out how to react. Brooks had none of it. She paused. He looked at Hayes like Hayes was a problem he'd already solved and was mildly bored with. You think he was just too shocked to react? Ramirez shook her head slowly. Shock looks a certain way. That wasn't shock. She looked out toward the range. I've seen combat veterans carry themselves like that. After enough, I don't know. After enough of the real thing, I think your sense of what qualifies as dangerous gets recalibrated pretty significantly. The person she was talking to thought about that. You think Brooks was military? I think, Ramirez said carefully, that he is not simply what he appears to be. Victor Hayes, meanwhile, was having a different kind of week. He had expected the drink incident to do what public embarrassments usually did, establish a pecking order, discourage the target, and move on. Clean. Simple. Instead, something strange was happening. People were talking about Brooks. Not in a bad way. That was the part that bothered Victor most. He'd caught pieces of conversation. Did you hear what Ramirez said about him? And apparently, he fixed the generator in under an hour. The maintenance guys have been trying to figure that out for 3 days. And the way he just stood there, man, I couldn't do that. And each piece felt like a stone in his shoe. Small. Inescapable. He hadn't wanted to create interest in Daniel Brooks. He'd wanted to erase him. It'll blow over, said Specialist Dawkins, the youngest of the group that had been with Victor at the banquet. He was also the most likely to say things Victor wanted to hear, which was why Victor kept him around. I'm not worried about it, Victor said. Which was, of course, exactly what a man said when he was beginning to worry. The first real crack appeared 11 days later. It happened during a routine inspection of the North Storage Facility, where several pieces of tactical equipment had been flagged for maintenance. Daniel was on site with Rivera working through the list. The equipment in question included a set of communication relay units, older models, the kind that required a specific calibration sequence to test properly. Most of the base's maintenance crew had learned to work around the complexity by just running a basic output test, which told you if the unit was completely dead, but not much else. Daniel ran the full sequence. On the third unit, he found something that the basic test would have completely missed. Rivera, he said. Come here. Rivera leaned over. What is it? This relay's been outputting clean on the surface test, but look at the calibration data. Daniel walked him through it. See this variance. That's within tolerance, isn't it? Barely, and it's degraded from last quarter. Daniel pulled up the previous record on his tablet. And the quarter before that. Small variance each time. If you just look at this quarter, you pass it. But if you look at the trend, Rivera followed the numbers. It's going to fail. Not today, probably not this month, but push it under heavy operational load. In cold weather, this relay goes down at a critical moment. He set down the tablet. And whoever's depending on that relay doesn't get a warning. They just lose contact. Rivera looked at the unit, then at Daniel. How'd you know to check the calibration history? Daniel started tagging the unit for replacement. Because when something fails, it usually didn't just fail. It was failing for a while. You just weren't watching the right thing. Rivera stared at him for a long moment. Brooks, he said slowly. What did you do before this? Maintenance. Before maintenance. Other things. Rivera didn't push, but he thought about it for the rest of the day. I thought about the way Daniel had handled the relay, the specific vocabulary, the instinct to look at trends rather than snapshots, the understanding that a system working on paper could be failing in ways that only matter under pressure. That wasn't maintenance training. That was something else. 2 weeks after the banquet, Victor Hayes made his second move. It wasn't dramatic. Victor was smart enough to avoid dramatic in the daylight. Instead, he made a comment in the command briefing, a small, almost casual observation, that the maintenance section's oversight of tactical equipment was a civilian operation with civilian limitations, and that perhaps it was time to have uniformed personnel take a more active role in reviewing the maintenance schedules. It was aimed with precision at Daniel. The CO, Colonel Marsh, had filed it away without visible reaction. But Daniel had been in the room, not at the briefing table. He'd been called in to discuss the relay finding. Ramirez had escalated it, which was how it came up in the briefing at all. He'd been sitting in a chair along the wall the way civilians did when they were in military command spaces, present, but peripheral. He'd heard Victor's comment. Victor had made sure he heard it. And Daniel had written something on the notepad he carried. Not a response. Not a plan. Just 3 words that he wrote automatically, the same 3 words he'd been writing in notebooks since he was 24 years old. And a chief petty officer had told him that the best way to keep perspective was to name the thing you were actually dealing with. Ego, not threat. He capped his pen. He waited. Colonel Marsh looked at him, a brief assessing look, and said, Brooks, walk me through the relay finding. And Daniel did. Calmly. Precisely. With the specific kind of technical confidence that comes not from needing to impress anyone, but from simply knowing the material. Victor across the room said nothing. Afterward, Colonel Marsh stopped him in the hallway. Good catch on the relay, Marsh said. How'd you spot the calibration drift? Looked at the history. The current quarter read clean, but the trend was clear. Marsh nodded slowly. He was a careful man, not the kind to ask questions he didn't intend the answer to matter. You have a background in communications equipment. Some. Marsh looked at him for a moment, in the way that men with experience look at other men with experience. A kind of quiet recognition. You know, Marsh said, when you came on board, I pulled your civilian employment record. Standard process. I know. There was a gap, about 9 years. Daniel met his gaze. Yes, sir. Marsh didn't push. He was too good a commander to push when pushing wasn't the right tool. Carry on, Brooks, he said, and walked away. That night, Emma had a question for him. She was working on her veterans project again, and she'd gotten to the part about what soldiers felt like when they came home. My teacher said some of them found it really hard, Emma said. Being home, I mean, because everything was different than what they were used to. That's true for some. Did you find it hard when you came home? He was quiet for a moment. Yeah, he said. For a while. What was the hardest part? He thought about it. The real answer was complicated too. Complicated for an 8-year-old, too complicated honestly for most conversations. But Emma had always been able to hold more than people expected. The quietness, he said finally. When you've been somewhere where everything matters a lot, every sound, every movement, every decision, and then you come home and the stakes are different, it takes a while to recalibrate. What does recalibrate mean? Readjust, reset, learn what the new normal is. Emma thought about this. Did you? Did I what? Recalibrate. He looked at her serious face, her big looping handwriting on the project in front of her, the way she tucked one knee up under herself when she was thinking hard. I'm working on it, he said honestly. She seemed satisfied with that. She went back to her project. Can someone be a hero and still be regular? He looked at that sticky note again. He still hadn't answered it. But something was building on the base. He could feel it the way you feel a weather change before you see it. Not the incident with Victor, not the relay finding, not the quiet conversations people were having about him that he only caught the edges of. Something bigger. The kind of thing that doesn't announce itself. The kind of thing that just arrives. He'd lived long enough and in enough uncertain places to know the difference between a day that was going to be ordinary and a day that was going to ask something of him. He just didn't know yet which day it was going to be. But the feeling was there. Patient. Waiting. Like a tide that had been pulling back for a long time and was about to come forward. He did his work. He went home. He called Emma good night. And he waited too. The feeling Daniel had carried into the weekend didn't leave him the way ordinary feelings did. It stayed low, like a frequency. He couldn't quite tune out. Not anxiety, not dread. Something older than both. A kind of readiness his body had never fully unlearned. He'd spent years trying to talk himself out of it, trying to convince the part of his nervous system that had been trained to treat stillness as a warning sign that stillness was actually fine. That quiet was allowed. That nothing coming was sometimes just nothing coming. Most days it worked. That Monday morning, it didn't. I was in the East Equipment Bay by 6:15, running through the weekly inventory with the same methodical attention he brought to everything. Not because anyone was watching, but because the habit of precision was one of the few things he'd brought back from his former life that hadn't cost him anything to keep. Rivera was supposed to join him at 6:30. Rivera showed up at 6:22, which Daniel noted without saying anything, because Rivera being 8 minutes early meant Rivera had something on his mind. "You hear about the training rotation?" Rivera said, not quite looking at him, setting down a coffee cup he'd clearly forgotten to drink from. "Which one?" "The joint exercise, scheduled for Thursday. They're bringing in an outside assessment team." Rivera paused. "Word is Hayes pushed for it. Made a case to Marsh that the maintenance section's equipment readiness needed independent verification." Daniel kept moving through the inventory list. Okay. Rivera finally looked at him. "Brooks Hayes is basically trying to audit your entire operation in front of an outside team. If they find anything, then we fix it. That's not the point. The point is, he's going after you, systematically. The comment in the briefing was first, now this." Rivera lowered his voice, even though they were alone. "People are starting to notice the pattern." Daniel set down the tablet. He looked at Rivera, not the long measuring look he sometimes gave people, but something more direct. "Have you noticed anything wrong with our equipment readiness?" Rivera blinked. "No." "Have the units we're responsible for had any failures?" "No, the opposite actually, the relay catch." "Then let them audit." Daniel picked the tablet back up. "Clean operation doesn't fear inspection, Rivera. That's the point of running a clean operation." Rivera stared at him for a long moment. Then he picked up his coffee, finally drank from it, and made a face because it had gone cold. "You know what gets me about you? I'm sure you'll tell me. You never seem rattled, like ever, even when you should be." Daniel moved to the next row of equipment. "I seem rattled plenty. I'm just quiet about it." Rivera watched him work. "Is that something you learned, or something you just are?" "Both," Daniel said. "Now help me with the hydraulic checks before 0700. Rivera helped, but he kept watching Daniel in the sideways way that people do when they're trying to solve a puzzle they haven't been given all the pieces to. Daniel noticed. He always noticed. He just didn't make it anyone's problem. The day moved in the way that Mondays at Fort Calloway always moved, with the specific energy of a machine that had been resting over the weekend and was now remembering that it had a purpose. Units moved through training cycles. The motor pool processed 3 vehicle maintenance requests before noon. A piece of range equipment threw a fault that turned out to be nothing, a loose cable 2 minutes to fix, and the training cycle it would have delayed ran on time. Daniel was back at his desk by 2 in the afternoon when Sergeant Kim appeared in the doorway of the maintenance office. She didn't knock. She never knocked. Daniel had noticed early on that Kim operated on the assumption that if a door was open, it was an invitation, which was a military habit he recognized and didn't mind. "You know about Thursday," she said. "Rivera told me this morning." Hayes briefed the assessment team personally, before the CO signed off on the format. She sat down in the one chair across from his desk that wasn't occupied by a parts catalog. "That's irregular. Assessment teams are supposed to get their parameters from the command, not from senior NCOs with personal agendas." "Did you bring that up with Marsh?" "Not yet." She looked at him steadily. "I wanted to know if you were going to." "No." "Why not?" "Because raising it looks defensive. And I'm not defending anything. If Hayes wants to spend his political capital on an equipment audit, let him. When the audit comes back clean, that capital is gone." Kim was quiet for a moment. She had a particular kind of quiet, not comfortable but thinking. "And if it doesn't come back clean, then I fix whatever's wrong. You're not worried." It wasn't a question. She said it the way you say something when you're still working out whether it's a compliment or a warning. "I'm appropriately aware," Daniel said. "That's different from worried." She tilted her head slightly. "You know Ramirez said something about you after the banquet." He waited. "She said you reminded her of guys she'd worked with overseas. The ones who'd been in long enough that fear kind of recalibrated. Found a new baseline." Kim watched him. She wasn't wrong, was she? The office was quiet. Down the hall, someone was on a phone call, the words not quite audible through the wall. "Kim," Daniel said, "whatever you're fishing for." "I'm not fishing for anything." She stood up. "I'm just paying attention, same as you." She moved toward the door. "Thursday, 0800 in the main bay. Hayes will be there personally. FYI. "I'll be there at 0700. She almost smiled. "Yeah, I figured you would." She left. Daniel leaned back in his chair, looked at the ceiling for approximately 4 seconds, and then returned to the maintenance schedule he'd been updating when she arrived. Tuesday passed. Wednesday passed. He called Emma both evenings. Wednesday night she told him she'd gotten a 92 on the first section of her veterans project, and that her teacher had said her question, "Can someone be a hero and still be regular?" was the most interesting framing she'd seen from a student in years. "What does framing mean?" Emma asked. "The way you look at something, the angle you choose." "Oh." She processed this. "So she liked my angle." "She liked your angle." "Is it your angle too?" "I thought about that." "Yeah, Em, it's my angle." "Good," she said, sounding satisfied in the specific way that 8-year-olds sound when they feel they've confirmed something important. "Because I think regular is actually harder than hero." He didn't say anything for a moment. "Get some sleep," he said. "Already working on it." He sat with the phone in his hand after the call ended in the kitchen, with the overhead light on and the rest of the apartment quiet around him. On the table in front of him, underneath Emma's project notes, was a photograph he kept meaning to move to somewhere less visible and kept not moving. It was 4 years old. It showed 3 men in cold weather gear on a terrain that was not identifiable at a time of day, that was not quite morning and not quite night. The faces were turned slightly away from the camera, a habit even in supposedly casual photos of men who had learned not to look directly at documentation. He was the one on the left. He was 20 pounds heavier in the photograph. He looked 10 years younger and 10 years older at the same time. He turned the photograph face down. He went to bed. Thursday arrived the way consequential days sometimes do, without fanfare, without warning, just already present when the alarm went off. He was in the main equipment bay at 0658. He had pulled the complete maintenance records for every piece of tactical equipment in his section. Not just the current quarter, not just the last 6 months, but the full history going back to when he had taken over as supervisor. He had printed it in a format that was clean and readable and did not require any special knowledge to understand, because he had learned a long time ago that the best defense was clarity. Not argument, not preemption. Clarity. Rivera arrived at 0705 and stopped when he saw the organized stacks on the work table. "You did this last night. And this morning." Rivera looked at the documentation. "This is really thorough." "It should always look like this," Daniel said. "It just usually lives in the system. Today it lives on paper." Cho arrived at 07 Then two of the other maintenance crew guys, whose names the assessment team wouldn't know. By 07:45, the full section was present, everyone clear on what was being assessed and what their role was in the assessment. At 0800, the assessment team arrived. There were three of them, a major named Calloway, who had the efficient manner of someone who had done many assessments and found them largely tedious, and two warrant officers, whose role was primarily technical documentation. They came in with clipboards and tablets, and the specific professional neutrality of people who were paid to have no opinion until they'd finished the work. Victor Hayes arrived 30 seconds behind them. How was in his dress uniform for a routine equipment assessment. Daniel noted this without expression. Victor's eyes found Daniel immediately. He gave him the kind of look that was designed to communicate without words that the terms of engagement had changed, that this wasn't the banquet anymore, that here in front of an outside team with rank and documentation and command structure all present, Victor was in his natural environment. Daniel gave him nothing back, not defiance, not deference, just the same level present attention he gave to everything. Major Calloway introduced himself, explained the parameters of the assessment briefly and professionally, and then asked to begin with the communication equipment. This was not an accident. Victor had structured the assessment order. The communication equipment was where he expected to find the most friction older units' complex maintenance histories. The kind of thing that a civilian supervisor with civilian limitations might mismanage. "Of course," Daniel said. "I have the complete maintenance history printed for each unit. I can walk you through the documentation while your technical team runs the diagnostics, or I can step back and let them work independently. Whatever's more useful." Major Calloway looked at the organized documentation Daniel set in front of him. Something moved across the major's face, not surprise exactly, but a kind of recalibration. "We'll start with the documentation review." They started. For the first 20 minutes, the assessment moved at the pace of any professional review. Methodical, procedural, the kind of pace that made time feel slower than it was. Victor stood to the side with his arms crossed watching. He was waiting for something. At the 22-minute mark, Warrant Officer Tran flagged something. "This unit." She pointed to one of the relay components. "It's been pulled from service." "Yes," Daniel said. 10 days ago, calibration drift identified through trend analysis on the maintenance history. I flagged it for replacement." "What's the current status?" "Replacement unit has been ordered. Estimated delivery is next week. In the interim, we have a backup unit operating in its position." He pulled the relevant documentation. "The backup unit's maintenance history is here." Tran looked at the documentation, then at Daniel. "You caught this through trend analysis. The current quarter diagnostic read clean. The quarter-over-quarter variance told a different story." There was a pause. Tran and the other warrant officer exchanged a look, the kind of look that professionals exchange when they're encountering work that exceeds what they expected to encounter. "That's not standard maintenance protocol," Tran said. "It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation." "No," Daniel agreed. "But it's better than standard." Victor uncrossed his arms. The assessment continued. Over the next 2 hours, the outside team worked through every piece of equipment in Daniel's section. They found 2 minor issues, a calibration adjustment needed on a secondary sensor and a documentation gap where a training note hadn't been logged properly in the system. Daniel acknowledged both immediately without defensiveness, and produced the underlying records that explained the context of each. He didn't argue. He didn't qualify. He named each issue and explained exactly what had happened and what he would do about it. Major Calloway made notes. By 10:30, the assessment was functionally complete. The major asked a few final questions, procedural routine, and then conferred quietly with his 2 warrant officers for approximately 4 minutes. Victor was still standing to the side. His arms were crossed again. He had the expression of a man who had come to a fight and found a chess match. "Mr. Brooks." Major Calloway turned to him. "Overall, this is one of the more thorough maintenance operations I've assessed at an installation this size." The trend analysis process you've applied to the communication equipment in particular is something I haven't seen implemented at the civilian level. Where'd that come from? The room was very quiet. Daniel felt Victor's attention sharpen from across the space, a physical sensation, like a change in air pressure. Experience, Daniel said. Military background. I've worked around military equipment for a long time. Calloway looked at him for a moment, in the way that Marsh had looked at him, that particular measuring quality. Well, whatever the source, it's effective. He turned to make a final note. I'll have the written assessment to Colonel Marsh by end of day. 2 minor findings, both adequately explained. No systemic concerns. He extended his hand. Daniel shook it. Victor said nothing. He left before the assessment team did. Rivera waited until Victor was gone, and the outside team was packing up their materials before he walked over to Daniel and said in a voice pitched low, "Did you just win?" "There was nothing to win," Daniel said. "There was an assessment. It happened. You know what I mean." Daniel began consolidating the documentation. "Go help Cho with the afternoon schedule. Brooks. Rivera. Seriously, I want to know, did you know it was going to go like that?" Daniel paused. He looked at Rivera, at the younger man's mix of admiration and something that was almost frustration. The frustration of someone watching a person be calm in circumstances that don't seem to warrant calm. "I knew our operation was clean," Daniel said. "I knew the documentation was accurate. I knew the trend analysis on the relay was sound." He stacked the last of the folders. "Beyond that, I didn't know how it was going to go. I just knew that the only thing in my control was the quality of our work." He picked up the stack. "That's always the only thing in your control. And either it's enough or it isn't." Rivera was quiet for a moment. "That's either really simple or really deep," he said. "Both," Daniel said. "Come on." Word moved fast. By mid-afternoon, the maintenance section knew. By 4 o'clock, the story had reached the East Range. By the time Daniel was driving home, Ramirez had apparently already told 3 people what Warrant Officer Trun had said about the trend analysis, and those 3 people had told several others, and the shape of the story was changing again, evolving from Brooks didn't fight back at the banquet into something else, something less easy to label. Because a man who didn't fight back could be read as weak. But a man who ran an operation so clean that an outside assessment team complimented him in front of the man who called the assessment, that was something different. That required a different explanation. The base was quietly revising its understanding of Daniel Brooks. He didn't know all of this that evening. He knew some of it. He had the kind of peripheral awareness of base social dynamics that came from paying attention without appearing to a skill that had other applications he no longer used. What he focused on driving home was the conversation he was going to have with Emma about her 92, and whether he had the ingredients for the pasta she liked. He did. He made it. They ate together at the small kitchen table, and she told him about a disagreement she'd had with her best friend Chloe, which had something to do with a game rule that Chloe had apparently invented and then insisted had always existed. "She just made it up," Emma said. "I know she made it up. She knows I know. But she wouldn't admit it." "Did it matter?" "In terms of the game." Emma thought about it. "Kind of. It made her win." "Did she need to win?" Another pause. Longer this time. "I think she just really wanted to." "People do that sometimes," Daniel said. "They need to win something, so they change the rules to make sure they do. It doesn't mean the win was real." Emma twirled pasta on her fork. "Is that what that sergeant did at the dinner, changed the rules?" He looked at her. "What do you mean? Like he made it so he was the important one, and you were the one who wasn't supposed to be there. He changed the rules of the room." She ate the pasta. "But you didn't play by his rules." Daniel set down his fork. He said. "How are you 8 years old?" She gave him a look of tremendous patience. "I'm almost 9. "Right. Almost 9. "Did I get it right?" "Yeah," he said. "You got it right." She seemed pleased the way she was pleased when math worked out the way it was supposed to. Satisfied and unsurprised at the same time, because she had done the work and trusted the result. He thought about that later, after she was asleep, sitting again at the kitchen table, with a cup of coffee that was actually warm this time. He thought about the way a child can sometimes cut through to the truth of something, in the time it takes an adult to construct 12 reasons why the truth is complicated. She changed the rules of the room. You didn't play by his rules. He hadn't thought of it in exactly those terms. But she wasn't wrong. Victor Hayes operated in rooms where the rules were about rank and volume and the performance of dominance. And in those rooms, those rules were real. They had weight. They had consequence. They organized people into positions that were hard to escape. Daniel knew that. He'd been inside institutions long enough to understand how powerfully those invisible rules governed behavior. What Victor hadn't counted on was a man who had spent years in environments where those rules didn't exist, where performance was lethal, where reputation was irrelevant, where the only thing that mattered was whether you were effective or you weren't. A man who had been stripped down to function so completely that the social theater of rank and humiliation had simply ceased to register as a threat. You couldn't intimidate someone who had already been afraid of things that would break you. You couldn't humiliate someone whose self-worth had been tested in fires that had nothing to do with a dinner banquet. Daniel hadn't chosen not to react because he was better than Victor. He'd chosen not to react because Victor's weapon didn't work on him. And that he understood now was what had rattled Victor most. Not defiance, not strength, immunity. The sound of a car outside pulled him back. He looked at the window, then at the clock. He turned off the kitchen light and went to check on Emma out of the habit that parents develop not because you think something is wrong, but because the act of checking is its own small form of love. She was asleep the way children sleep when they're unbothered completely all at once, like a switch had been thrown. He stood in the doorway for a moment. The photograph on the kitchen table was still face down. 3 men in cold weather gear on terrain that couldn't be named. A time of his life that couldn't be explained in a dinner conversation, or a hallway, or an assessment review. He had done things in that life that he was proud of. He had done things in that life that he carried differently. He didn't talk about either, but something was shifting on this base. Something in the way people were starting to look at him. Starting to ask questions that stopped just short of the real question, and Daniel could feel it the way you feel a tide coming in before the water actually touches you. The real question was coming. He just didn't know yet what form it would take when it arrived. He turned off Emma's light and went to bed. Friday passed quietly. The weekend came. He fixed the hinge on Emma's bedroom door, the one he'd been meaning to fix for 3 weeks. She stood and watched him do it with the intensity of a person observing a skilled procedure. "How do you know how to do that?" she asked. "I worked on things that broke." "What kind of things?" "Lots of kinds." "Daddy." "Yeah." "You never finish your sentences when I ask about before." He tightened the last screw, tested the door. Perfect swing. "What do you want to know?" She thought about it seriously. "Were you good at what you did?" A long pause. "Yeah," he said. "I was good at it." "Were you happy?" He looked at the door. The clean swing of it, the precise catch of the latch. "I was good at it," he said again quietly. "Happy is different." Emma considered this with the gravity of a small person encountering a large idea. Then she opened and closed the door 3 times to test it herself. "It works now," she announced. "It does." "I like it when things work," she said, and walked down the hall to the living room, as if that settled everything. He stood in the doorway for a moment, wrench in hand. She wasn't wrong about that either. Monday came. And with it, Victor Hayes made his 3rd move. This one was different from the first 2. The banquet had been about humiliation. The assessment had been about bureaucratic leverage. This was something else, something that Daniel recognized the shape of immediately, because he had spent years studying the shape of escalation. Victor requested a formal meeting with Colonel Marsh. He cited concerns about civilian personnel operating in proximity to sensitive tactical training components, without appropriate oversight protocols. He submitted a written brief. He had apparently been preparing it for a week. Daniel was informed of the meeting by Kim, who had somehow obtained a copy of the brief within 3 hours of its submission. She dropped it on his desk at 2:15 in the afternoon. He's escalating, she said. Daniel read the brief. It was 3 pages. It was carefully written, professional measured, not obviously personal. Someone had helped him with the language, possibly more than one person. He's asking for a structural change, Daniel said. Maintenance reporting would run through his office before going to Marsh. Yes. Which would mean anything my section finds any equipment issue, any safety concern he controls the timeline on when it reaches command. Yes. Daniel set the brief down. That's not about me. Kim looked at him. What do you mean? If I were gone tomorrow and they brought in someone else to run maintenance, this brief still makes sense as a power play. He's not trying to get rid of me. He's trying to own the information my section produces. Daniel looked at the brief again. Because after the relay catch and after the assessment, he knows we're finding things. He wants to control what happens to what we find. Kim was very still. I hadn't thought about it that way, she said slowly. That's because you were thinking about it as being about me. Isn't it about you? Partly. But the part that matters structurally, the part that could actually hurt people, is the information control. If maintenance findings have to go through Hayes before they go to command, there's a delay window. Things get filtered. Things get timed differently. Daniel looked at Kim. What if we catch something critical, and Hayes decides the timing isn't convenient for whatever he's running? Kim's expression shifted. Something moved behind her eyes that was past professional concern and into something more personal. That's a real problem, she said. That's the actual problem. So what do you do? Daniel leaned back in his chair. He thought about Emma's pasta and the door hinge and the photograph face down on the kitchen table. He thought about a chief petty officer who had told him once that the best tactical response to a complex threat was always the simplest one available. Find the center. Address the center. Everything else is noise. I request a meeting with Marsh, Daniel said, before Hayes's brief is formally processed. Kim stared at him. That's aggressive. For you. It's not aggressive. It's timely. He stood up. There's a difference. He put in the meeting request at 2:45. Marsh's administrative officer came back with a slot at 4 o'clock that same afternoon. At 3:58, Daniel walked into the command building with one piece of paper. Not a counterbrief. Not a multi-page response. One page, a clear, simple diagram showing the current maintenance reporting structure, and next to it, the proposed structure under Hayes's brief, and next to that, a column labeled Implications. He sat across from Colonel Marsh, and he explained it in exactly the way he explained everything, without drama, without personal grievance, with the specific clarity of someone who understood the material and respected the intelligence of the person he was talking to. Marsh listened without interrupting. When Daniel finished, Marsh looked at the single page for a moment. The relay finding, Marsh said. If this reporting structure had been in place when you made that catch, it would have gone to Sergeant Hayes first. He would have had discretion over timing. And given the nature of his relationship with your section, I can't speak to what he would have done, Daniel said. I can speak to what the structure would have made possible. Marsh looked at him. That's a careful way to say something, Marsh said. I'm a careful person. Another silence. Brooks, Marsh said, I'm going to ask you something directly, and I'd appreciate a direct answer. Daniel waited. Your employment record shows 9 years of what is listed as federal contract work. No specifics. No agency identification. Just a clearance level that, Marsh paused, is higher than most of what we work with here. He looked at Daniel with the eyes of a man who had spent a career reading people. What do I actually know about who I have in my maintenance section? The office was very quiet. Daniel held the colonel's gaze. He thought about Emma asleep in her room, about the hinged door that now swung clean, about the photograph he kept face down, about the 3 words he wrote in notebooks, about the way Kim had said whatever you used to be. You know what you've observed, Daniel said. Clean operation, good catches, no failures. That's not an answer. It's the answer that matters for the job. Marsh studied him for a long moment. The kind of moment that has weight. I'm going to table Hayes's brief pending further review, Marsh finally said. And I'm going to do it because the structural argument you've made is sound, not because of whatever's in that employment gap. He held Daniel's gaze. But I want you to know whatever's in that gap, it's in the room every time you make a call like the relay catch. And people are starting to notice. Daniel nodded once. Thank you for your time, sir, he said. He walked back across the base in the cool late afternoon air and felt the tide, the one he'd been sensing for weeks, the one that had been pulling back since the night of the banquet shift. Just slightly. Just enough. Not forward yet. But the direction had changed. And Daniel Brooks, who had spent years learning to read the difference between weather coming and weather passing, knew which one this was. He got in his truck. He drove home. He made dinner. He didn't think about Victor Hayes. But for the first time in weeks, he thought briefly quietly without opening the door too wide about the men he'd served with. About cold water and dark skies and the specific silence of operating somewhere that didn't exist on any map that anyone would admit to. About who he had been in those places and what that person would make of this quiet life, this small apartment, this 8-year-old daughter who asked questions that cut right to the bone. I thought that person would probably be surprised. And then he thought more slowly, more honestly, that that person would probably understand. Because that person underneath everything the training had built and the missions had shaped had always wanted the same thing. Something worth protecting. Something real. Something that didn't disappear when the operation ended. He heard Emma's voice from the living room. She was on a video call with Chloe, the two of them, apparently having resolved whatever the game rule disagreement had been, speaking with the rapid, overlapping enthusiasm of children who have completely forgotten there was ever a conflict. He stood in the kitchen doorway and listened. The tide was coming in. He didn't know yet what it would bring, but he'd been in enough water to know how to move when it arrived. The tide Daniel had felt shifting on Monday evening came in faster than he expected. Tuesday started like any other, 0630 in the equipment bay. Coffee going cold on the corner of his workbench. Rivera moving through the morning checklist with the focused efficiency he'd developed over the past few weeks, ever since the assessment. Something had changed in Rivera after that Thursday. He worked differently, paid closer attention, asked better questions. Daniel noticed, but didn't comment on it the same way you don't comment on a plant growing, you just make sure the conditions stay right. At 0712, Shio came in from the North Storage Facility, with a look on his face that Daniel recognized immediately. Not panic. Cho wasn't a panic person, but something tight and controlled that meant he'd encountered something he didn't know how to categorize. We've got a problem, Cho said. What kind? The kind I don't have the vocabulary for. Daniel set down his coffee. Show me. They walked the 200 yards to the north facility in the cold morning air without speaking. Cho didn't elaborate, which Daniel respected. If Cho didn't have the vocabulary for it, then describing it badly would be worse than not describing it at all. Inside, Cho pointed to the secondary communications array, a cluster of relay and signal amplification units that supported the Eastern Training Range during large-scale exercises. They were older equipment maintained by Daniel's section for the past year. Nothing exotic. Nothing that should produce the look currently on Cho's face. Daniel looked at the display readouts. Then he crouched and looked at the back of the primary unit. He was quiet for approximately 45 seconds. When's the next large-scale exercise? He asked. Thursday, Cho said. Joint training operation. Full battalion rotation plus the assessment units that are still on base. How many personnel in the field? Ramirez said upward of 200. Daniel stood up slowly. He looked at the array again with the specific quality of attention that Cho would later describe to Rivera as the look of someone reading a language no one else in the room could see. This entire array has been running on degraded power regulation for at least 3 weeks, Daniel said. The primary regulator is failing. Not slowly anymore, it crossed a threshold sometime in the last 48 hours. He pointed to a component at the back of the rack. See that coupling? It should have a consistent thermal signature. That coloring is heat stress. The regulator has been compensating for the coupling failure by drawing from secondary power, and now the secondary is starting to show the same stress pattern. Cho stared at the coupling. What happens if it goes down during the exercise? The Eastern Range loses communication coverage, all of it, simultaneously. Cho absorbed this. 200 people in the field. In a training exercise that involves live fire components on the Eastern Range. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. How did we miss this? Cho asked quietly. Not defensively, genuinely. We didn't check this unit in the trend analysis cycle. It wasn't flagged for priority review because its surface diagnostics have been reading clean. Daniel crouched again, examining the coupling. Whoever installed this coupling used the wrong thermal grade compound. It's been degrading since day one, just slowly enough to read normal until it wasn't. Can we fix it before Thursday? We need the right parts. And we need to pull this unit entirely, not just replace the coupling, because I want to know what the secondary stress has done to the rest of the rack. He stood up. Get Rivera. I need him to run a full inventory check on the spares we have on hand. And I need you to pull the installation records for this array. I want to know who did the original setup and when. Cho moved. Daniel stayed where he was for a moment, looking at the array. He ran the math in his head, not because he was uncertain, but because running the math was a habit that had saved him in other contexts, and he saw no reason to stop doing it now. Parts availability, labor time, testing window before the exercise. It was tight. Not impossible. Tight. He pulled out his phone and called Kim. She answered on the second ring. You're calling early, she said. I need you to do something, and I need you to not ask why until I explain it to you. A pause. Okay. Find out if Hayes has any role in the Thursday exercise coordination, specifically if he's involved in the communications support planning. Another pause, longer this time. That's an interesting question. Yes or no is all I need right now. Give me 20 minutes. He hung up. He went back to his section office, sat down, and began documenting what Cho had found with the same methodical precision he brought to everything. Because the documentation mattered. Not just for the fix for the record. For the clear, unambiguous record that what was discovered now by his section with full disclosure to command before anything went wrong. He'd learned in a former life that the timeline of awareness was everything. When you knew, and what you did, the moment you knew, that was the accountability record. That was what held up under scrutiny later. Rivera came in at 0731. Cho told me, what do you need? Spares inventory, thermal coupling components, power regulation, hardware secondary array backup units. Everything we have on hand, what we can get locally, and lead time on anything we have to order. Rivera sat down and started working. He didn't ask questions, he just worked. Kim called back at 0748. Hayes is the senior NCO liaison for Thursday's exercise communication support, she said. He's been coordinating with the range officers for the past 2 weeks. Daniel closed his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. He would have seen the surface diagnostics on the Eastern Array. Yes, Kim said. He would have. And he signed off on the communications readiness. Daniel. Kim's voice shifted. Are you telling me what I think you're telling me? I'm telling you we have a failing array that supports 200 people in a live fire training environment on Thursday, and the person responsible for signing the communications readiness assessment has a documented personal interest in undermining my section's credibility. He let that sit for a moment. I'm not making an accusation. I'm describing a situation that requires command-level awareness immediately. Kim was quiet for 3 full seconds. I'll be there in 10 minutes. She was there in 7. She looked at the array. She looked at the documentation Daniel had already prepared. She asked 2 technical questions, sharp, precise, and Daniel answered both. Then she looked at him with the expression of someone who has just understood the full shape of something they'd been seeing from the wrong angle. He knew, she said. It wasn't a question. I don't know that, Daniel said carefully. I know the surface diagnostics read clean. I know he would have relied on surface diagnostics. I know that if he had applied the trend analysis method we use, he would have caught it. Possibly. But he doesn't use trend analysis because he thinks civilian maintenance is She stopped herself. "I'm not making the argument that he knew and hid it," Daniel said. "I'm making the argument that command needs to know about this now from us clearly and completely before anything else happens." Kim looked at him. There was something in her expression that had moved past professional respect into something more personal. The look of a person watching someone operate with a kind of controlled discipline that they recognize as rare. "Let's go to Marsh," she said. They went to Marsh. It was 0820 when they walked into the command building. The administrative officer tried to tell them the colonel was in a scheduled briefing. Kim looked at the officer and said calmly, and without aggression, that what they needed to discuss had safety implications for Thursday's exercise, and Colonel Marsh would want to know about it before the briefing concluded, rather than after. The administrative officer looked at Daniel's documentation, then at Kim's face, then picked up the phone. They were in Marsh's office at 0831. Daniel laid it out in 6 minutes. The array, the failing regulator, the thermal coupling, the timeline, the Thursday exercise. He did not mention Victor Hayes by name. He presented the technical situation clearly, completely, and without editorial. Marsh listened. He asked 2 questions. He looked at the documentation. Then he said, "Who signed the communications readiness assessment for Thursday?" Kim said, "Sergeant First Class Hayes, sir." Marsh's face did not change in any dramatic way. He was a man who had learned to process difficult information without letting the processing show. But something shifted behind his eyes, the specific kind of shift that happens when a pattern becomes visible. "What's your repair timeline?" he asked Daniel. "If we have the parts on hand or can source them locally by end of day today, we can have the array rebuilt and tested by Wednesday evening. Tight, but achievable. If we have to order, we're looking at Friday at the earliest, which means the exercise either delays or uses an alternative communications configuration." What's the alternative configuration? Mobile relay units from the Western Range. They're rated for the load. The setup adds about 45 minutes to the pre-exercise communication check. Marsh nodded once. "Get me a parts confirmation by noon. If you have what you need, proceed with the repair. I'll handle the exercise coordination notification." He paused. "And I'll be reviewing the readiness assessment process." Daniel and Kim stood to leave. "Brooks," Marsh said. He turned. "Good catch." Daniel nodded once and walked out. In the hallway, Kim exhaled a long, slow breath that she'd clearly been holding for a while. "How are you this calm right now?" "I'm not calm," Daniel said, already moving toward the exit. "I'm focused. There's a difference. Let's find out about the parts." Rivera had the parts inventory ready when they got back. The news was mixed. They had the thermal coupling components. They had the secondary power hardware, but the primary regulator replacement was a specific model that wasn't in their on-hand supply. "Lead time?" Daniel asked. "Standard order is 3 days, Rivera said. "But I found a distributor in the city that shows 1 unit in stock. If someone can physically go get it." "I'll go," Cho said immediately. Daniel looked at him. "You know what you're looking for." "You described it. I pulled the specs." Cho held up his phone. "I have the model number, the tolerance specs, and the distributor address. I can be there and back by 2. "Go," Daniel said. Cho left at door 914. What followed was the kind of workday that Daniel had experienced in other forms, in other contexts, under different kinds of pressure, but never quite like this. Because this pressure had a specific texture. It wasn't the pressure of hostility or danger or uncertain outcomes. It was the pressure of craft. Of a problem with specific parameters and specific solutions, and a clock that was honest about how much time you had. He loved this kind of pressure. He had always loved it. It was one of the things that had made him good at what he used to do, and one of the things that transferred cleanly into what he did now. He and Rivera worked through the morning on the parts they could address, pulling the damaged coupling, cleaning the housing, testing the secondary units individually, to map exactly what the stress had done and what was still sound. The work was methodical and precise, and Rivera, who had been good before, was noticeably better now, anticipating the next step. Asking questions before Daniel needed to redirect him. Developing the instinct for where the problem was likely to be, rather than waiting to be shown. At 11:45, Rivera said, "Can I ask you something?" "You're going to anyway." Rivera almost smiled. "The way you approached this morning, the timeline, the command notification, the part sourcing all at once. You were running 3 problems simultaneously, and you weren't stressed." "I was." "You didn't look it. I told you, focused is different from calm." Daniel was checking a connection. When you're managing multiple problems, stress is a resource allocation issue. You can spend your cognitive capacity on the anxiety of the situation, or you can spend it on the situation. You can't do both equally. Rivera thought about this. "Did someone teach you that?" "Yes." "Who?" A pause. "Someone who understood how to work under pressure." "Military." Daniel looked at him. Not the long measuring look. Not the closed professional look. Something in between, the look of a man deciding in real time how much of a door to open. "Rivera," he said, "when this is done, and the array is running, and Thursday's exercise goes the way it needs to go, ask me again." Rivera blinked, then nodded. Something in his expression said he understood that this was not a deflection, it was a promise. Cho came back at 13:47 with the regulator unit. 2 sandwiches he'd bought at a place near the distributor and an energy drink he hadn't touched because he'd apparently been too focused on not damaging the part in transit. He handed the part to Daniel the way someone hands over something they understand is important, carefully, with both hands. Daniel checked it against the specs. Perfect match. "Good work," he said. Cho looked like he'd been told something that mattered. They installed the regulator that afternoon. The work took 4 hours, not because the installation itself was complex, but because Daniel ran the verification sequence 3 times on each component. Not because he doubted the work, but because 200 people in a live fire exercise deserved 3 verifications rather than 1. Rivera understood why without being told. Cho asked once and then understood when Daniel explained it in 1 sentence. By 1730, the array was rebuilt. By 1800, they were running the full operational test. The array came up clean. Not just functional, better than its previous baseline, because the failed coupling had been degrading performance slightly for months, and no one had caught it. With the new components properly installed and calibrated, the signal quality on the eastern range was measurably improved. Daniel looked at the test results for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "Document everything, every step, every timestamp, every part number. I want a complete record filed with command by 1900. "Already building it," Rivera said. Daniel walked outside and stood in the cold evening air. He was tired. The specific good tired of work completed correctly, not the tired of defeat or frustration, but the tired that comes from spending yourself on something that mattered and having it come out right. He thought about calling Emma. He looked at his watch. She'd be doing homework. He called anyway. She answered on the 3rd ring, slightly breathless. "I'm finishing my science worksheet." "I'll be quick. You okay?" "Fine. Are you okay?" "You sound tired." "Good tired." "What does that mean?" "It means something needed fixing, and we fixed it." "Oh." He heard her pencil on paper. "Was it hard?" "Time sensitive." "That's different from hard." He smiled. "Yes, it is. Go finish your worksheet." "Okay, Daddy?" "Yeah." "I told Chloe what you said about how some people change the rules to make sure they win." "What did Chloe say?" "She said that's exactly what she did, and she said sorry." He stood in the cold air and felt something move through him, something warm and uncomplicated and rare. "Good," he said. "I know right anyway. I gotta finish this." "Go. I love you." "Love you too. Bye." He stood outside for another minute. Then he went back in. The documentation was filed at 1847. Marsh acknowledged it at 1903. At 1921, Victor Hayes sent a message through the base communication system, requesting clarification on a maintenance report that referenced the Eastern Array. The message was addressed to Daniel's section and copied to Marsh's administrative office. Daniel read the message. He read it again. Then he showed it to Kim, who had stayed late. He's fishing, Kim said. He's worried about what the repair documentation shows. Does it show anything? It shows we found it, reported it, fixed it, and documented it. That's all. Daniel set the message down. The question it raises about the readiness assessment, that's not in my documentation. That's in Marsh's review. Which Hayes knows is happening. Yes. Kim looked at him. What do you want to do? Reply professionally. Confirm the repair, reference the documentation, thank him for his attention to the matter. Daniel's voice was even. And nothing else. Kim stared at him. You're giving him nothing to use. There's nothing to give. The work speaks. She shook her head slowly. You know what you are, Brooks. He waited. Infuriating, she said. In the best possible way. He drafted the reply. 3 sentences. Professional, complete. He sent it. Then he drove home, made dinner, not pasta. This time, just soup from a can and bread, and the kind of meal that tastes fine when you're tired and you're not trying to impress anyone, and fell asleep earlier than he had in 2 weeks. Wednesday passed, Thursday arrived. The joint exercise began at 0700, with 212 personnel moving through the Eastern Range in the largest training operation the base had run in months. The communications array ran clean. The signal quality on the Eastern Range was the best it had been in over a year. The exercise coordinators commented on it in the post-operation notes. Daniel heard about this secondhand from Ramirez, who came by the maintenance section at end of day with an expression that was as close to satisfied as her professional manner usually allowed. Good week, she said. Good week, he agreed. She looked at him for a moment. Hayes has been quiet. Okay. That's unusual for him. People get quiet when the thing they were betting on doesn't work out the way they planned. Ramirez studied him. She had a particular way of looking at people, assessing careful the look of someone trained to read a situation rather than react to it. It was a look Daniel recognized because he used it himself. Brooks, she said, I want to ask you something. Okay. And I want you to know that how you answer or whether you answer, I'm going to respect that either way. He waited. Where did you serve? The question landed in the room with a specific kind of weight. Not heavy in a threatening way. Heavy in the way of something real, something that had been hovering in the air for weeks and had finally decided to come down and stand on the floor. He looked at Ramirez. He thought about what Marsh had said, about what Kim had said, about Rivera and Cho, and the way this entire base had been quietly revising its understanding of him for weeks. He thought about the photograph face down on the kitchen table and the 3 men in cold weather gear on terrain that couldn't be named. He thought about Emma's question. Were you happy? Happy is different. A long time ago, he said carefully. In a capacity I can't detail, in places I can't name. He held Ramirez's gaze. I left because I wanted something different. Not because of anything that happened. Just because I wanted something different. Ramirez was quiet for a moment. Was it special operations? She asked. He didn't answer. She nodded once, a nod that said she understood the non-answer and what it meant. Okay, she said. She turned to leave. Ramirez. She looked back. The exercise went well, he said. That's what matters today. She held his gaze for a moment. Yeah, she said softly. It does. She left. Daniel sat alone in his office for a while after that. The maintenance section was quiet. Rivera and Cho had gone home. The equipment was logged. The documentation was filed. The building had the particular late-day quiet of a place that had done its job and was resting. I thought about the week. The array. The parts run. The documentation. The 3-line reply to Hayes that had given him nothing. The repair completed 8 hours before 212 people went into the field. The way the exercise had run clean. He thought about the accumulation of it. Because that was what it was, an accumulation. Not a single dramatic moment. Not a confrontation or a revelation or a scene from a movie where the truth comes out all at once in a way that resolves everything. Just work done correctly over time, leaving a record that couldn't be argued with. I thought about what Victor Hayes had been trying to do and what he had actually accomplished. Because the irony of it was that every move Hayes had made had produced the opposite of his intended result. The banquet had created curiosity instead of humiliation. The assessment had created proof instead of exposure. The brief had prompted a command review that was now examining Hayes's own readiness assessment. And the array that Hayes had cleared with surface diagnostics because he didn't know about trend analysis, or didn't care, the array had become the clearest possible evidence of exactly the gap that Daniel had been quietly demonstrating for months. Civilian limitations. Hayes had written that in his brief. Civilian limitations. Daniel looked at the testing data from the array repair on his desk, at the trend analysis that had found the original relay issue, at the documentation record that was now complete and filed and time-stamped. He picked up his jacket. He turned off the light. He walked out into the cool evening air and got into his truck and sat for a moment before starting the engine. His phone buzzed. A message from a number he didn't recognize. He looked at it. The message said, "We need to talk. Not through channels." VH. He read it twice. Victor Hayes. He sat with it for a long moment. The engine wasn't running. The parking lot was mostly empty. The flag at the edge of the lot moved slowly in the evening wind. He thought about what a direct approach from Victor Hayes meant. Not a brief. Not a comment in a briefing. Not a structured assessment designed to create the appearance of professional concern. A personal message off-channel. That was a different kind of move. That was a man who had run out of structural options. Daniel put the phone in his pocket. He started the engine. He drove home. He didn't reply that night. Heimat dinner. He called Emma goodnight. He sat at the kitchen table and looked at the photograph, face down, and thought about what Victor Hayes becoming desperate might mean for the situation on the base, not for himself personally, but for the people around him, for the structure of the command, for the clarity of what the past few weeks had established. Desperate men made different kinds of moves than confident men. He had seen this. In other places, in other circumstances, desperation was not safer than confidence. It was less predictable, less governed by the usual calculations. He needed to think about this carefully. He needed to sleep first. He turned the photograph over before he went to bed. He wasn't sure why. He just did. 3 men in cold weather gear. Terrain that couldn't be named. A time of day that was not quite morning and not quite night. He looked at the man on the left for a long moment. He looked like someone who was very good at his job. He also looked like someone who hadn't yet figured out what he was going to do when the job was over. Daniel turned the photograph face down again and went to bed. The next morning he replied to Hayes's message. 3 words. When and where. He hit send. Then he got in his truck and drove to the base and went to work. Because whatever was coming, whatever Victor Hayes had decided that off-channel meant, whatever the next move looked like it was coming, regardless of whether Daniel thought about it or not. And the only thing in his control was the quality of what he did between now and then. He'd been here before, not at Fort Calloway, not with a man named Hayes, but at the intersection of something building and the choice of how to meet it. He'd been here before, in darker places and higher stakes, and he had learned one thing above everything else about that particular intersection. You didn't rush toward it. You didn't run from it. You simply did your work, and you let the moment arrive when it was ready. Hayes replied at 0611 the next morning. Motorpool Annex, Saturday, 0800. Come alone. Daniel read it while standing in his kitchen with his first cup of coffee, Emma still asleep down the hall. He read it the way he read everything that mattered, once fast, to get the shape of it, once slow to check what the shape was hiding. He turned the phone face down on the counter, finished his coffee, and didn't think about it again until Emma woke up and asked if they could have pancakes. They had pancakes. Hai made them the way she liked, thin, with the edges slightly crispy butter. Only no syrup, because she'd decided 3 weeks ago that syrup was too sweet now. A declaration she'd made with the conviction of someone who had thought carefully about the matter and arrived at a firm conclusion. He didn't question it. He made them without syrup, and she ate 4 of them and talked about a book she was reading for school. Something about a girl who trained horses, and Daniel sat across from her and listened, and thought that this specific ordinary Saturday morning was something he would not trade for anything that had come before it. Not the missions. Not the clearances. Not the particular electric feeling of operating at the edge of human capability in places that didn't officially exist. Not any of it. This was better. He dropped Emma at Mrs. Garner's at Aero 7:30, told her he had an errand to run, and drove to the base. The motor pool annex was a secondary building attached to the east side of the main vehicle bay, a space used primarily for equipment storage and overflow maintenance work. On Saturdays, it was largely empty. Daniel arrived at 0752 and sat in his truck for 3 minutes before going inside, not because he was hesitant, but because he wanted to arrive after Hayes. Arriving second was a choice. It meant Hayes had been in the space longer, had settled into it, had moved past the initial adrenaline of the confrontation he'd been building toward. Men who had burned off their opening energy were easier to read. Hayes was standing near the center of the space when Daniel walked in. Out of uniform civilian clothes, which was itself a signal. He'd made a choice to meet outside the structure of rank. That meant something. He looked different without the uniform. Not smaller exactly, but less armored. The performance of the rank wasn't available to him here, and without it, he was just a large man in jeans and a work jacket standing in an empty building, trying to figure out how to start a conversation he'd initiated. "Brooks," he said. "Hayes," Daniel said. Neither of them moved toward the other. Hayes looked at him for a moment. His jaw worked slightly, the jaw he always held at that angle that suggested he'd already decided he was the most important person present. Except today, the angle wasn't quite the same. Today, it was the jaw of a man working through something. "I'll skip the part where I pretend this isn't about what it's about," Hayes said. "I'd appreciate that." The array. Hayes looked at the floor, then back up. "I signed the readiness assessment." "I know. I used the surface diagnostics, standard protocol." "I know. You found something I didn't find." "Yes." Hayes waited, clearly expecting Daniel to add something, a qualification, a dismissal, something that would make what he was saying easier to say. Daniel gave him nothing. Not unkindly. Just nothing. If that exercise had run with the array in that condition. Hayes stopped. He started again. 200 people. Live fire components. If the communications went down at the wrong moment. "Yes," Daniel said. "How'd you catch it?" "Trend analysis. Quarter-over-quarter calibration data. The surface read clean. The history told a different story." Hayes absorbed this. He crossed his arms, then uncrossed them until Daniel noted. A man deciding whether to hold himself closed or open. "That's not standard maintenance protocol," Hayes said. "No, but it's effective." "Where'd you learn it?" Daniel held his gaze. "Experience." Hayes looked at him for a long moment. Then he said something that clearly cost him something to say. "I almost got people hurt." The room was very quiet. "You didn't know what you didn't know," Daniel said. "That's different from negligence." "Is it?" "Yes. Negligence is knowing the risk and accepting it anyway. You didn't know the risk was there. Because I didn't look hard enough. Because you used the tool you had. The tool wasn't adequate for the problem." Daniel kept his voice even, not harsh, not generous, just factual. "Now you know there's a better tool." Hayes was quiet for a moment. The quiet of a man processing something that didn't fit the shape of his existing understanding. "Marsh is reviewing my readiness assessment," Hayes said. "I know. He's going to find that I cleared the equipment you subsequently found to be failing." "Yes. That's going to raise questions about my judgment." "Probably." Hayes looked at him. "You could have made it worse. The way you documented the repair, you could have framed it differently." "I documented what happened, accurately." "You could have been less accurate." Daniel looked at him steadily. "No, I couldn't have." Hayes held his gaze. And in that moment, in the specific quality of that extended eye contact, something shifted. Not dramatically, not like a scene from a movie, just a small internal rearrangement, the kind that happens when a person encounters a boundary they cannot argue past because it isn't a position. It's a fact about who someone is. "Why didn't you?" Hayes asked. "Why didn't I what?" "Make it worse, for me. You had every reason." "The drink at the banquet." "Yes." "The assessment you called." "Yes." "The brief you submitted." "Yes." Hayes said it flatly without flinching. "All of it. You had every reason." Daniel put his hands in his jacket pockets. "The people on that exercise didn't have anything to do with what's between you and me. The array was a safety issue. You document safety issues accurately because people depend on that documentation." He looked at Hayes. "It's not complicated." Hayes stared at him. "Most people would have used it. I know." "That's—" Hayes stopped. He looked like he was trying to find a word and couldn't find the right one. "That's not what I expected from you." "What did you expect?" Hayes was quiet for a moment. Then, with the specific difficulty of a man who does not often admit things, he said, "I expected you to be what I decided you were when you walked through the door 14 months ago." "What was that?" "Someone who didn't belong." The words hung in the space between them. Daniel didn't respond to them immediately. He let them sit where they'd been put the way you let a difficult thing sit, rather than rushing to cover it or argue with it. "Why?" he asked finally. Genuinely. Not confrontationally, genuinely. "Why was that the decision?" Hayes's jaw worked again. "Because you were quiet. Because you didn't announce yourself. Because you didn't have anything on your record that I could see that explained—" He stopped. "You just showed up, ordinary, and I don't trust ordinary in this environment." "Because ordinary in this environment usually means someone who got here through a side door." "Yes?" "And I looked like someone who got here through a side door." "Yes." Daniel looked at him. "I came through a very specific door," he said. "You just couldn't see it." Hayes held his gaze. The question was right there. The question everyone had been circling for weeks. The question Marsh had pointed at, without pushing the question. Ramirez had asked directly the question Rivera had asked and been promised an answer to when the time was right. Hayes didn't ask it directly, but he said, "I know what a man looks like who's been places. I know what it does to the way you carry yourself, the way you move, the way you react or don't react to things that should be provocative." He paused. "I've been watching you for 14 months, and I have been wrong about you for 14 months, and I need to understand what I was wrong about." It was, Daniel thought, the most honest thing Victor Hayes had probably said to another person in years. He took a slow breath. "I was a Navy SEAL for 9 years, he said. Hayes didn't move. "Classified operations, multiple deployments. I left when my daughter was 2 years old, and my marriage was done, and I had to make a choice about what kind of father I was going to be and what kind of man I was going to be." He held Hayes's gaze. "I didn't leave because I failed. I left because I chose differently." Hayes stared at him for a long time. A very long time. The kind of long time that means a person is not just processing information, but processing the meaning of having been wrong in a way that had consequences. "The banquet," Hayes said finally. "Yes. I poured a drink on a Navy SEAL. You poured a drink on a single father who was trying to have a quiet evening." Daniel kept his voice level. "That's what I am now. The other thing is history." Hayes looked at the floor, then back up. "Why didn't you say something at the time, or after? You had the material to bury me." "Because I'm not in the business of burying people," Daniel said. "And because the thing that would have given you the most was me performing who I used to be to shut you down. I'm not doing that anymore. That's not why I kept the training. I kept it because it's part of me, not because it's a weapon." Hayes absorbed this. He looked like a man standing on ground that had turned out to be different than the ground he thought he was standing on, not unstable, but different, requiring a different stance. "I need to ask you something," Hayes said. "And I need you to be straight with me." "Okay." "The brief I submitted, the reporting structure change." Hayes looked at him. "Was I doing it because I genuinely thought there was an oversight problem, or was I doing it because—" He stopped. "Because you wanted control of what my section found," Daniel said. Hayes was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about that question since Marsh tabled the brief." What's the answer? Both, Hayes said. I think it was both. I think I told myself it was the first one. And I think I knew somewhere it was really the second one. He exhaled. That's not who I want to be. Daniel looked at him. He looked at him with the specific quality of attention that he gave to things that mattered, not analyzing, not measuring, not determining threat. Just present, just honest. Then don't be that, he said simply. Hayes looked at him like those 3 words had been unexpected. Like he'd come here braced for a larger conversation and had instead been handed something so straightforward it was almost disarming. That's it, Hayes said. That's it. You're not going to lecture you, tell you what you owe, make a list of what needs to happen. Daniel shook his head. You know what you did. You know what it cost. You know what the alternative looks like. The choice is yours. Hayes looked at the floor again. His hands, Daniel noticed, were not crossed anymore. They were at his sides. Open. The men I had with me at the banquet, Hayes said. The ones who laughed. Yes. They look at you differently now. They've been looking at you differently since the assessment. I know. That's because of what you've done, not what you used to be. That's the point, Daniel said. Hayes looked up at him. I put them in a position where they had to recalibrate what they thought about judgment, about what earns respect. He said it like a man pulling a splinter, the relief of getting it out mixed with the discomfort of acknowledging it had been there. I did that to them. You also showed them what recalibrating looks like, Daniel said. By being here, by having this conversation. Hayes blinked, like that hadn't occurred to him. The space between them had changed. It was the same building, same morning light through the high windows, same 2 men. But the geometry of it had shifted not into friendship, not into easy resolution, but into something more honest than either of them had been operating in before. What happens now? Hayes asked. You go to Marsh before he comes to you, voluntarily. You acknowledge the limitation in the readiness assessment process, not as a personal failure, but as a systemic gap. You propose a fix, and you mean it. Hayes looked at him. And the brief. You withdraw it, on your own initiative, before it becomes a formal finding. And if I do that, I don't have any interest in your career, Hayes. I have an interest in this base running safely and the people on it being looked out for properly. Daniel looked at him directly. That's it. That's the whole interest. Hayes stood with that for a moment. He stood with it the way a person stands with something heavy when they're deciding whether they can carry it. Then he said, I underestimated you. Yes. I was wrong to do it. Yes. I'm telling you I was wrong. Daniel looked at him. He thought about the drink on his shirt, the cold, deliberate weight of it, the room going still, the way Emma had said you didn't play by his rules, the 3 words he'd written in a notebook, ego, not threat. I know, he said. Hayes nodded once. The nod of a man who has said what needed to be said and is now moving forward. Not comfortable, not resolved in any simple way, but moving forward. He walked past Daniel toward the exit. He stopped just before the door. Brooks. Daniel turned. The seal thing. Hayes's voice was different now, quieter, stripped of the performance quality that usually colored it. That stays between us. Daniel looked at him for a moment. I don't tell stories about myself, he said. I never have. Hayes held his gaze for one more moment. Then he nodded and walked out. Daniel stood alone in the annex. He stood there for a while. I wasn't thinking about Hayes. He was thinking about what it cost a man to walk into a room and say I was wrong when he had built his entire identity around never being wrong. About what kind of internal pressure that required. About whether what had just happened was the beginning of something or the end of something. He decided it was neither. It was just true. And true things had their own weight, their own timeline, their own way of working through a system. He drove back to Mrs. Garner's and picked up Emma. She was in the middle of a card game with Mrs. Garner and deeply invested in it. I'm almost done, she said without looking up. She's winning. I'm terribly sorry. Mrs. Garner said, not looking sorry at all. He sat down and waited. Emma won. The next hand declared the game concluded on her terms, thanked Mrs. Garner with the specific formal politeness she deployed when she was also very pleased with herself, and walked to the car. In the truck, she looked at him. "How was your errand?" "Interesting." "Good interesting." "Interesting." He considered. "Necessary interesting." She thought about this. "Was it about that sergeant?" He glanced at her. "What makes you say that?" "Because it was Saturday morning, and you only go to the base on Saturday mornings when something's on your mind." She looked out the window. "And the only thing that's been on your mind lately is that sergeant." He drove for a moment without speaking. "Yes," he said. "It was about him." "Is it over?" "Some of it." "What part isn't over?" He thought about how to answer that. About Hayes walking into Marsh's office. About the brief being withdrawn. About the 212 people who had gone into the field on Thursday and come back safely and never knew there'd been a decision that protected them. About Rivera asking again when this was done and the answer being closer now. "The part that takes time," he said. "Some things you can fix in a day. Other things need longer." Emma nodded. She seemed satisfied with that. She pulled out the book she'd been reading, the one about the girl who trained horses, and opened it and was immediately absorbed. Daniel drove. Monday came. Hayes walked into Marsh's office at 0845 and withdrew the brief on his own initiative. He acknowledged the gap in the readiness assessment process and proposed a supplementary review protocol that incorporated the trend analysis methodology. Daniel's section had been using. He framed it as a systemic improvement, not a personal correction. Kim told Daniel about it at 11 that morning with the expression of someone reporting something they hadn't expected to need to report. "He walked in and did it himself," she said. "No prompting, no meeting scheduled, just walked in," Daniel nodded. Marsh apparently said very little, just listened, asked a few questions about the proposed protocol. Kim looked at Daniel. And then he asked Hayes where he'd learned about trend analysis and maintenance review. What did Hayes say? He said he'd been briefed on it by someone with relevant experience. Kim paused. And he left it there. Daniel looked at the maintenance schedule on his desk. "Good," he said. Kim watched him for a moment. "You had a conversation with him." "Saturday." "I figured." She tilted her head slightly. "What did you say to him?" "What needed to be said." She let that sit. "Is that all I'm getting?" "That's all there is. The rest was between him and me, and—" Kim nodded slowly. She looked at him with the expression she sometimes used, the one that said she was seeing more than she was commenting on. "You know, most people, after what he put you through, most people would have let him twist. Would have let the Marsh review play out and taken the professional vindication. I know. You didn't." "No." "Why?" Daniel set down his pen. He thought about how to say this accurately, not inspirationally, not in a way that sounded like a lesson, just accurately. "Because vindication isn't what I was here for," he said. "I'm here to do the job. The array is fixed. The exercise ran clean. The reporting process is going to improve. The job got done." He picked up his pen again. "Everything else is noise." Kim looked at him for a long moment. "I want to say something," she said. "Okay, and I want you to actually hear it instead of deflecting it." He put the pen down. "You are one of the most genuinely decent people I have encountered in 18 years of military service," she said. "And I don't use that word lightly. Decent, not talented, not impressive. Decent." She held his gaze. "It's rarer than people think." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "Thank you," he said. She nodded once, turned, and walked out. He sat with that for a while. The word she'd used. Decent. Not brave. Not skilled. Not strong. Not the vocabulary of his former life. Decent. He thought it might be the best thing anyone had said about him in years. Maybe ever. At 3 that afternoon, Rivera appeared in the doorway. "Hey," Rivera said. "You told me to ask again when it was done." Daniel looked up. "I did." Rivera came in and sat down. He had the look he sometimes got, the focused, serious look that didn't come naturally to him, but that he'd been developing over the past weeks, the look of someone who was becoming who they were going to be. "Before here," Rivera said. "What did you do?" Daniel looked at him. He thought about Hayes standing in the annex with his hands at his sides. He thought about Kim saying the word decent. He thought about Emma's sticky note question. He thought about the three men in cold weather gear. He thought about what it had taken to become the man who sat at this desk instead of the man in that photograph. And he thought that Rivera, who was becoming someone, deserved the truth of it. "I was a Navy SEAL," Daniel said. "For 9 years, classified operations. I left to raise my daughter." Rivera sat very still. "I don't talk about it," Daniel continued, "because I don't want it to be the thing people see when they look at me. I'm not that anymore. I'm this." He gestured vaguely at the office, the maintenance section, the base. "And this is enough. This is what I chose." Rivera stared at him for a long time. "That's why," Rivera said finally. "Why what? Why you're the way you are, the way you handled Hayes, the relay catch, the array, the way you just operate." Rivera shook his head slightly. "I kept trying to figure out the explanation, and the explanation was right there." "It's part of the explanation," Daniel said. "Not all of it." "What's the rest?" Daniel thought about Emma eating 4 pancakes without syrup, about Mrs. Garner and the card game, about the door hinge that swung clean, about the particular good tired of a week's work well done. "The rest," he said, "is what I was trying to get to when I left." Rivera absorbed this. He was quiet for a moment in the way of someone reorganizing their understanding of something. "Does Marsh know?" Rivera asked. "He suspects. He hasn't asked directly." "Does Hayes know?" "Yes." Rivera blinked. "You told Hayes before you told—" He stopped. "You know what that actually tracks." "He needed to know. You didn't. You had all the information you needed to do your job. But you told me now. You asked the right question at the right time." Rivera sat with that. Then he said, "What do you want me to do with it?" Daniel looked at him steadily. "Your job. Same as always. Better than yesterday." Rivera nodded. He stood up. He started for the door. "Rivera." He turned. "You've been different the last few weeks," Daniel said. "The way you work, the questions you ask, the attention you bring." Rivera looked at him slightly uncertain. "That's you," Daniel said. "Not me. Don't mistake what's yours." Rivera stood in the doorway for a moment. Something moved across his face, not the easy enthusiasm he usually wore, but something quieter, something settling. "Thank you," he said. He left. Daniel sat alone in the office. Outside through the wall, he could hear the base going about its afternoon vehicles' voices, the distant sound of something mechanical being tested on the range. The ordinary sounds of a place doing its work. He pulled the maintenance schedule toward him. There were 3 units due for review next week. A piece of range equipment with an intermittent diagnostic flag that no one had been able to reproduce. A vehicle battery system that was showing early signs of the same kind of degradation he'd caught in the relay. Ordinary work. Important work. Work that mattered in the way that quiet things matter, not dramatically, not visibly, but consistently. Reliably. With the specific value of something you can count on. He opened the schedule and began to plan. Somewhere across the base, Hayes was walking out of a building having done something hard and necessary. Somewhere down the hall, Rivera was going back to work differently than he'd gone to work 3 weeks ago. Somewhere in a classroom, Emma was almost certainly asking a question that her teacher hadn't expected. The tide had come in. It had brought what tides bring, not always what you expected, not always what you planned for, but real, present, changed. He worked until 6. He drove home. He made dinner. He called Emma good night. He turned the photograph right side up on the kitchen table and left it that way. The photograph stayed right side up on the kitchen table for 3 days before Emma noticed it. She came out on a Thursday morning school bag, already on her back. Hair half brushed, moving with the particular efficient chaos of a child who has decided she is almost ready and needs only to locate one more thing before she is completely ready, and she stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at the table. "Who are those people?" she asked. Daniel was at the counter pouring coffee. He turned and looked at the photograph, then at her. "People I used to work with," he said. She came closer. She looked at it with the focused attention she gave to things that interested her. Not quick, not glancing, but the full study of something she intended to understand. "Which one is you?" "Left." She looked. "You look different." "I was different." "How?" He thought about how to answer that honestly without answering it in a way that was too large for a Thursday morning before school. "Younger, and thinking about different things." Emma looked at the photograph for another moment. Then she looked at him with her mother's eyes and her own particular directness. "Are they still alive?" The question landed the way her questions sometimes did, without warning, perfectly aimed. "Two of them," he said. She nodded slowly. Not dramatically. The way children nod when they've received information that confirms something they already suspected about how the world works. "Do you miss them?" "Every day," he said. "In a quiet way. The kind of missing you learn to carry." She picked up the photograph and looked at it for another moment, then set it back down carefully, right side up, exactly where it had been. "I'm glad you're here," she said. Then she found the thing she'd been looking for, a colored pencil that had apparently migrated to the kitchen table, put it in her bag and said, "I'm ready." He drove her to school. On the way back, he sat in the parking lot of a gas station for 4 minutes and did not try to stop the feeling that moved through him. The full, complicated, unnameable feeling of being someone who had come from one world into another, and somehow against the odds of who he used to be, had managed to bring himself with him. Then he drove to work. It was 3 weeks after the conversation in the motor pool annex. 3 weeks since Hayes had walked into Marsh's office and withdrawn the brief. The base had continued to move, the way bases always move, with the grinding, relentless forward energy of an institution that doesn't have time to stop and assess what just changed. People had other things to handle. Exercises ran. Equipment broke and was fixed. The morning reports got filed. The afternoon reports got filed. The weeks moved. But something had changed in the texture of the base. Daniel felt it in small ways. The way Ramirez now stopped by the maintenance section occasionally with questions that were framed as questions, but were really conversations. The way a person begins to have conversations with someone they have decided is worth talking to. The way Cho had started staying 20 minutes late every Tuesday and Thursday without being asked, working through the trend analysis methodology on his own, building the skill into something he actually owned, rather than something he'd been shown once. The way Rivera moved through his work faster, more confident, with the specific forward lean of someone who has stopped wondering whether they're capable and started simply being capable. And Hayes. Hayes was the most unexpected change, not dramatic. Not a conversion story, not the kind of turn that announces itself. Just a gradual, almost imperceptible shift in how he moved through the base. He still commanded space when he entered a room. He still carried the weight of his rank with the ease of someone who'd worn it a long time. But there was something different in how he directed that weight. A small redirection, like a river that hasn't changed its volume, but has changed its angle by a few degrees, which over distance becomes an entirely different destination. He'd started using the trend analysis protocol in his oversight of other sections, not crediting Daniel directly, which Daniel had not expected him to, and did not require, but implementing it. Making it part of how he operated. Taking the tool and using it, which was the only form of acknowledgement that actually mattered. Daniel noticed. He didn't say anything. He just noticed. The Tuesday of the 4th week after the annex, Marsh called him in. Not an emergency, not a problem. Just when you have a moment, Brooks come by. Daniel went by at 10:15. Marsh was at his desk with a folder open in front of him, and he had the expression he sometimes wore when he was about to say something he'd been thinking about for a while. Not a difficult expression, just the look of a man who had prepared. "Sit down," Marsh said. Daniel sat. I want to tell you something, and I want to do it directly, because I think that's what you respond to. Yes, sir. In the 18 months you've been at this installation, the readiness record for your section has improved by 31%. The relay catch prevented what could have been a significant operational failure. The array repair directly ensured the safe conduct of an exercise involving over 200 personnel. Marsh looked at him. I want that on the record, officially, not just in the post-operation notes. Daniel said nothing for a moment. I appreciate that. I'm also going to tell you that I know more about your background than your employment record shows. Marsh held his gaze. Not the classified details. I don't have those. But I know the category of what you did, and I know what it takes to do it, and I know what it takes to walk away from it on your own terms. He paused. Both things are significant. The walking away isn't something I need credit for. I'm not offering credit. I'm offering understanding. Marsh leaned forward slightly. I run a base with 400 personnel. I need to understand who I have. He held Daniel's gaze. Now I do. The office was quiet for a moment. What do you need from me? Daniel asked. Nothing different than what you've been doing. Marsh closed the folder. I'm also going to tell you that Hayes came to me voluntarily. The brief, the protocol, you know about that. Yes, sir. What I'm telling you now is that in that conversation, he told me he'd spoken with you. He didn't give me details, but he said the conversation had been... Marsh paused, choosing the word carefully, clarifying. He looked at Daniel. I don't know what was said. It was private. I'm not asking. Marsh looked at him steadily. I'm telling you that whatever it was, it produced something I haven't seen from Hayes in the 3 years he's been here. He's been operating differently, better. A pause. Whatever you did, it worked. Daniel thought about Hayes in the annex, hands at his sides. Open. The specific difficulty of saying I was wrong when you've built an identity around never being wrong. He did the work, Daniel said. I just had a conversation. Marsh looked at him for a long moment. You know most people with your background, when someone treats them the way Hayes treated you at that banquet, the response is very different. I know. What made the difference? Daniel looked at the wall behind Marsh's desk. At the unit citations there, the photographs, the accumulated evidence of a career spent in service. He thought about Emma asking which one is you, and he thought about the answer he'd given, and he thought about what the true answer was underneath the one he'd given. I had something to lose, he said. The old version of me didn't have that. The old version operated in environments where the cost of escalation was just part of the accounting. You added it up, and you paid it, and you moved forward. He looked back at Marsh. Now I have Emma. And I have this job. And I have... He paused, searching for the right word. A life that I chose. That I built deliberately. And I am not willing to let someone else's aggression make me into a version of myself that puts any of that at risk. He said it simply. That's the whole answer. Marsh was quiet for a moment. That's a good answer, he said. Daniel stood. Was there anything else, sir? One more thing. Marsh opened the folder again. I'm submitting a recommendation that the trend analysis methodology your section developed be implemented base-wide as a supplementary readiness assessment protocol. Your section will be listed as the originating source. He looked up. Your name will be on it. Daniel held his gaze. Thank you, sir, he said. He walked out. In the hallway, he stopped and stood for a moment with his back to the wall and his eyes on the middle distance and let the full weight of that settle. Not the recognition that was secondary, but the protocol, the methodology. The thing he had developed through years of learned precision being formalized, named, attached to something that would outlast his time on this base. The relay catch and the array and every small precision that had seemed in the moment like just the job, it was becoming something that other people would carry forward. He stood there for 45 seconds. Then he went back to work. The week moved. Friday arrived and delivered as Fridays at Fort Calloway sometimes did a crisis in the afternoon. It started small. A fault alarm on the Western Range Communications Tower. one of the older fixed installations that dated back to the original base construction, maintained under a separate protocol from the equipment Daniel's section handled. The fault alarm triggered at 1340. The Western Range duty officer called it in. The base communications tech assigned to that tower was off-site at a training course and wouldn't be back until Monday. Standard procedure was to bring the tower down and run the Western Range on mobile relay until the tech returned. Inconvenient but not dangerous, given that Friday afternoon training was winding down, except that at 1348 it stopped being standard procedure. At 1348, a training team of 11 personnel, including 2 warrant officers and a mixed group of active and reserve soldiers, checked in from a field position 8 miles into the Western Range terrain. They were running an overnight navigation exercise. No extraction planned until Saturday morning. The exercise was designed to be communications monitored, but largely self-sufficient check-ins, every 4 hours emergency contact available. The tower going down meant the 4-hour check-in frequency was compromised. Not eliminated, they had radio backup, but the tower was the primary relay for the emergency contact system. If something went wrong out there Saturday morning, and someone needed immediate extraction, the emergency relay would be running on a degraded system. The duty officer, a young lieutenant named Park, who had been on post for 7 months and was handling his first solo Friday afternoon crisis, made 4 calls in rapid succession. He called the base communications office, which referred him to the tech who was off-site. He called the tech who explained the issue over the phone but couldn't walk him through the fix because the fault was hardware-specific. He called Ramirez, who told him the fault was outside her section's jurisdiction. Then he called the maintenance section. Rivera took the call. He listened for 90 seconds, then walked into Daniel's office and said 3 words. "We might have a problem." Daniel was on his feet before Rivera finished the sentence. Not because of what Rivera said, but because of the way Rivera said it. The specific tone of someone who has assessed something correctly and knows it. He listened to the situation in 45 seconds. "Which tower?" he asked. "Tower 6, Western Range." Daniel pulled the installation records from the filing cabinet. Not the digital system, the physical records. Because he'd learned in his first month that the physical records for the older infrastructure had documentation. The digital system hadn't been fully updated to include. He found Tower 6's maintenance history in 90 seconds. He looked at it for 30 seconds. "The fault is probably the primary signal coupling," he said. "These towers have a known failure mode in cold weather. The coupling contracts and loses contact. It's a physical issue, not a system issue." Rivera stared at him. "Can we fix it?" "Not remotely. Someone has to go up." "Up the tower." "Up the tower." Rivera absorbed this. That's not a maintenance section job. That's a certified tower tech job." "Are you wrong?" "No, but is there a certified tower tech available?" Rivera was quiet. "Get me the access equipment," Daniel said. "I'll make the call to Marsh after I've looked at the situation directly. Get me the harness kit from the West storage locker and meet me at Tower 6 in 15 minutes. Rivera looked at him. "Brooks." "Rivera." Daniel's voice was level. 11 people. Overnight in the field. Emergency relay compromised. What's the decision?" Rivera held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds. Then he turned and moved. Daniel called Marsh on the way to Tower 6. He explained the situation in 40 seconds. He told Marsh what he believed the fault was, what the fix would require, and what the alternative was. Marsh was quiet for a moment. "Your assessment of the fault confidence level?" "High, based on the installation history and the known failure mode for this tower series." "And the fix?" "Physical coupling replacement. 30 minutes up fix, 30 minutes down, maybe less." Another pause. "You're qualified for tower access." "I'm qualified for more difficult access than this." Marsh processed this without asking for elaboration. "Do it. Keep me informed." Daniel arrived at Tower 6 at 14:13. Rivera was already there with the equipment. Cho had come with him. Daniel hadn't asked. Cho had just shown up, which was Cho's way of saying he was in without having to say it. Daniel looked up at the tower. It was one of the older fixed installations, a lattice steel structure maybe 60 feet, the kind of thing that went up in the 70s and had been maintained ever since through institutional stubbornness and irregular attention. The wind was picking up from the northwest, which was relevant but not prohibitive. He suited up methodically. Not fast, not slow, the pace of someone who has assessed the risk and made the decision and is now executing. He checked the harness twice. Not because he doubted the equipment, because that was what you did. "I'll be on the radio the whole time," he told Rivera. "If the fault is what I think it is, the replacement coupling is in the kit bag top left compartment. I'll call down when I need it." Rivera nodded. His jaw was set in the way it sometimes got when he was managing concern he'd decided not to express. "You've done this before," Rivera said. It wasn't quite a question. "Similar things," Daniel said. "Stop worrying, it transfers." He started up. It took 11 minutes to reach the primary signal coupling housing. The wind at that height was sharper, which he noted and adjusted for without drama. The coupling was exactly where the record said it would be, and the fault was exactly what he'd said. It was the coupling had contracted in the dropping temperature and lost primary contact. A physical fix. The kind that required presence and hands and the specific calm of doing careful work in an exposed position. He called down to Rivera. "Coupling, top left, the smaller of the two." He heard Rivera moving in the kit bag. The fix took 16 minutes. Not because it was complicated, because he was 60 feet up in increasing wind on a Friday afternoon, and precision was more important than speed. He checked the coupling seating 3 times. He ran the manual verification sequence twice. He called down to Rivera with the result codes. "Tower 6 confirms signal restoration," Rivera called to the duty officer over the radio. A pause. Then Lieutenant Park's voice. "Tower 6 shows green. Signal confirmed." Rivera's exhale was audible even 60 feet up. Daniel started back down. He reached the ground at 1511. Rivera handed him a water bottle without speaking. Cho looked like he'd spent the last 30 minutes not breathing. "Signal's green," Daniel asked. "Green," Rivera confirmed. Park called Marsh directly. Said the team in the field has full emergency relay coverage. Daniel handed back the water bottle. He began removing the harness with the same methodical care he'd used putting it on. "You want to tell me," Rivera said quietly, "what kind of maintenance supervisor casually knows tower access protocol and coupling replacement procedure for a 60-foot fixed installation? The kind who reads the installation records thoroughly." "Brooks." "Rivera." Rivera looked at him. "You were never scared up there." "I was appropriately aware." "Of course you were." Rivera shook his head slowly. "Of course." Cho, who had been quiet, said, "Is this a normal day for you?" Daniel looked at him. "Define normal." Cho opened his mouth, closed it, looked up at Tower 6. "No, never mind. I don't want to know. I don't want to." They drove back to the section. Daniel filed the repair report with Marsh's office by 1545. The report was factual, complete, and described the fault and fix in technical terms without editorializing. He listed it as a maintenance section response to an active operational need and recommended the Tower 6 coupling series be added to the quarterly inspection rotation. At 16:01, Marsh sent a one-line response. "Well done." Daniel forwarded it to Rivera and Cho without comment. At 16:85, Hayes stopped by the maintenance section. This was unusual enough that Rivera and Cho both tracked him with their eyes as he came in, not suspiciously, but with the attention people give to things that have changed from their expected pattern. Hayes stopped at Daniel's office doorway. "Heard about Tower 6, he said. "It's in the report." "I know. I read the report." Hayes stood in the doorway without coming in. There was something different in how he was holding himself. The performance quality that usually occupied his posture had continued to diminish over the past weeks, and today it was almost entirely absent. I was just a man standing in a doorway. 11 people. Yes. You went up yourself. No one else was available with the relevant knowledge. Hayes looked at him for a moment. Then he said something that was clearly not the thing he'd originally planned to say, because the thing he'd originally planned to say was something more contained and professional, And what came out instead was more honest than that. "I've been doing this for 16 years, Hayes said quietly. "I have never once in 16 years gone outside my defined role to handle something personally because it was the right thing for the people in the field." He paused. "I've always worked the system, always found the procedurally correct answer." He held Daniel's gaze. "You went up a 60-foot tower in increasing wind on a Friday afternoon because 11 people needed the relay covered. That's—" He stopped. "That's the job," Daniel said. "It's more than the job. It's still the job." Hayes looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "I want to say something, and I want you to hear it." Daniel waited. "I've been doing this wrong, not everything, but the part where—" Hayes stopped, organized his thoughts, and started again. "The part where I decided that authority meant controlling what other people could do, what they could see, what information went where." His voice was level, not dramatic, the voice of a man stating a finding he's arrived at through careful examination. "That's not leadership, that's insecurity with a rank." He met Daniel's eyes. "You showed me that, not by saying it, just by operating the way you operate." The office was very quiet. "You didn't have to come here and say that," Daniel said. "No." "Then why did you—" Hayes was quiet for a moment. "Because you had the conversation with me in the annex that nobody else was willing to have. And you had it straight. No agenda, no leverage, just straight." He paused. "I figured I owed you straight back." Daniel looked at him. He thought about October, the dinner, the cold weight of a drink on his chest, the room going still, Emma's voice on the phone saying you didn't play by his rules, the 3 words in the notebook, the relay, the array, the brief, the annex, the tower. I thought about what it actually takes to change, not to apologize, not to perform change, but to actually begin becoming something different than what you've been. About the specific courage of it, the way most people don't do it, the way Victor Hayes, who was not an easy man and had never been a flexible man, was doing it imperfectly, one honest conversation at a time. "I know you meant to break something that night at the banquet," Daniel said. "I want to be straight with you about that. I know that's what it was." Hayes didn't flinch. "Yes. You didn't break it. I know. And I'm not saying that to make you feel bad. I'm saying it because what didn't break what I came in with and left with, that's worth paying attention to, for both of us." Daniel held his gaze. "You can build something like that. It takes longer than breaking things, but it holds." Hayes stood in the doorway for a moment longer. Then he extended his hand. Daniel looked at it for 1 second. Then he shook it. It was not a grand gesture. It was not a scene. It was 2 men in a small office at the end of a Friday afternoon, one of whom had poured a drink on the other 2 months ago and was now shaking his hand, and neither of them turned it into more than it was, because more than it was would have been less true. Hayes left. Rivera appeared from around the corner approximately 8 seconds later. "I wasn't listening," Rivera said. "You were." "I wasn't listening on purpose." Rivera. "Okay, I was listening." He came and leaned against the doorframe. "You shook his hand." "Yes." "After everything." "Yes." Rivera shook his head slowly, not in disbelief in the kind of slow wonder that looks like disbelief, but is actually admiration that hasn't found its full vocabulary yet. "I don't know how you do that. You lead with what you want the outcome to be," Daniel said. "Not with what you feel in the moment." He looked at Rivera directly. "The moment was 2 months ago. The outcome starts now. You lead toward the outcome." Rivera stared at him. "Did someone teach you that too?" "Life," Daniel said. "The regular kind. The kind that doesn't appear on any record." Rivera was quiet for a moment. Then, "Your daughter." Daniel looked at him. "That's where you learned it," Rivera said. "Not a question, a realization. Being her father, that's where you figured out how to lead toward the outcome instead of staying in the moment." Daniel held Rivera's gaze for a long time. He didn't say yes. He didn't need to. Rivera saw it in his face and understood. The weekend came. Emma had a soccer game on Saturday that her team lost by 1 goal in the final minute, a result that she processed with the specific mixture of disappointment and philosophical acceptance that she had been developing all season. She was quiet in the truck on the way home, not sulking, just thinking. "You okay?" Daniel asked. "Thinking," she said. "About the game. About why it hurts when you try your best and it still doesn't work." He drove for a moment. "Because it matters," he said. "If it didn't hurt, it wouldn't matter. The hurt is the proof." Emma thought about this. Does it always hurt less eventually? Usually, not always. Sometimes it stays and you just get bigger around it. She turned and looked at him. "Is that what happened with the things in your old life? The things you don't talk about, you got bigger around them." He kept his eyes on the road. "Yeah," he said. "Something like that." She nodded. She looked back out the window. "I think I can do that," she said. "I know you can," he said. "You already are." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Can we get ice cream?" He smiled. "Yeah, we can get ice cream." Monday morning arrived with the specific quality of a morning that has decided to be significant, regardless of whether anyone is prepared for it. Daniel was at his desk at 0640 when his phone rang. Not the desk phone, his personal cell. The number was one he recognized, but had not seen in over 4 years. He stared at it for one full ring before answering. "Brooks," he said. "Daniel." The voice on the other end was one he had not heard since the last time he'd been in a room that didn't officially exist. Low. Measured. The particular voice of a man who had spent decades in rooms where voices didn't carry. "It's Garrett. Master Chief Thomas Garrett, the man on the right in the photograph." "Tom," Daniel said. His own voice was careful, the way it went automatically when that world touched this one. "I'm going to keep this short," Garrett said. "I'm in the area, Fort Calloway specifically. I've been consulting with the command staff here on a training protocol review. I found out 3 days ago that you were working here." A pause. "I'd like to buy you a cup of coffee." Daniel was quiet for a moment. 3 seconds, maybe 4. "When?" he said. "Whenever works for you." "Noon," Daniel said. "The commissary." "Noon," Garrett confirmed. And then before he hung up, "It's good to know where you landed, Daniel. It sounds like you landed well." The call ended. Daniel sat with the phone in his hand. Thomas Garrett. The right side of the photograph. One of the two still alive. A man who had been in more dark places than Daniel cared to catalog, and had come back from all of them with the specific wholeness of someone whose identity was not threatened by what he'd survived. He put the phone down. He went back to work. He told no one about the call. At noon he walked into the commissary, and Garrett was already there sitting at a table near the back, civilian clothes coffee in front of him, watching the room with the quality of attention that never fully went away, no matter how long you'd been out. He was older than the photograph. They both were. But Garrett had the same stillness, the same quality of complete presence. He stood when Daniel approached, and they shook hands, and then because they were who they were, they didn't do any of the things that people who haven't seen each other in 4 years usually do. They didn't say "you look great," or "it's been too long," or any of the verbal filling that people use when they don't know how to get to what they actually want to say. They sat down. "How's the girl?" Garrett asked. "Emma. She's 9 in 3 weeks. A pause. "She's extraordinary." Garrett smiled, a real smile, the rare kind. "I always thought she would be. She had your stubbornness from the start." "She has more than my stubbornness. She has her own thing." Daniel looked at him. "What are you actually doing here, Tom?" "Told you. Protocol review." "And finding out I was here was coincidental." Garrett held his gaze. "The installation records have a civilian maintenance supervisor with a specific clearance level that doesn't match the job description. Someone on the command staff flagged it and it crossed my desk." He picked up his coffee. "I wasn't looking for you, but I'm not sorry I found you." "Okay," Daniel said. "What happens to the flag?" "Nothing. I cleared it. Your clearance history doesn't belong in a maintenance supervisor review, and I closed the question." Garrett set down the coffee. "I wanted to see you. That's the real reason I'm here." Daniel looked at him. "You've heard something," Daniel said. Garrett was quiet for a moment. "Word gets around about how you handled some things here. The equipment fines, the way you've operated." He paused. "Hayes. The conversation you had with Hayes." Daniel went still. "How do you know about that?" "Ramirez served under my command 4 years ago. We stay in contact." Garrett held his gaze. "She told me what she observed, about who you'd become here, about the specific way you handled a man who tried to break you in public and you didn't break." He paused. "I wanted to see it for myself." "See what?" "Whether you were okay." Garrett said it simply. "I've watched guys come out and struggle. Good guys. Guys who were the best in the room in any room that mattered, and then they got out, and the silence was too loud, and they couldn't find a way to make the next thing real." He looked at Daniel steadily. "I needed to know you weren't one of those guys." Daniel was quiet for a long moment. "I almost was," he said. "The first year. When the marriage was done, and Emma was 2, and I was doing contract work, I hated and trying to figure out what I was supposed to do with the rest of my life." He looked at his coffee. "I almost was one of those guys." "What changed?" "Emma looked at me one morning when she was about 2.5. She'd just figured out how to climb out of her crib. She climbed out, and she walked down the hall, and she came and stood next to my bed, and she just looked at me." He paused. "And I understood in that moment that I was either going to be present for her or I wasn't. That there was no in-between, and being present meant being okay. So I got okay." Garrett looked at him for a long time. "That simple. That hard," Daniel said. "But yes, that simple." Garrett nodded slowly. He picked up his coffee again. He seemed to be deciding whether to say the next thing. "We lost Martinez," he said. The name landed like a weight. Martinez. The man not in the photograph. The 4th member of the team in the years before Daniel left. "When?" Daniel asked. 14 months ago. Training accident. He'd re-enlisted." Garrett's voice was level, but there was something underneath it. The specific gravity of a man who has learned to carry loss professionally without losing the ability to feel it. "I thought you should know." Daniel closed his eyes for 3 seconds. "He was the best of us in the water," he said. "Yes. He never should have re-enlisted." "No." Garrett paused. "He didn't have what you had. Something to come home to." The commissary moved around them. Trays, voices, the ordinary noise of a place where people eat lunch and talk about their days. The ordinary noise of a world that had no idea what was happening at this particular table. Daniel opened his eyes. "I'm sorry I wasn't there," he said. "You were here. That's where you needed to be." Garrett held his gaze. "Don't take that away from yourself." They sat for a moment in the silence that only exists between people who have been through the same things and don't need to name them. Then Garrett said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that whatever your answer is, I'll respect it completely." Daniel waited. "There's a program, not operational consulting training design, working with the next generation of operators on specific skill sets that aren't being taught the way they should be." Garrett paused. "Your name came up. Not from me. From someone who reviewed your clearance flag and made some calls." He held Daniel's gaze. "It would be part-time. It would be here or close to here. Emma wouldn't need to move. You wouldn't need to return to anything you've left behind." Daniel felt the weight of the question settle into him. Not uncomfortably. Not like a threat, but like something real that required a real response. He thought about the maintenance section, about Rivera and Cho, about the trend analysis protocol with his name on it, about the protocol going base-wide, about Hayes shaking his hand on a Friday afternoon and meaning it, about Mark saying well done, about Tower 6 and the coupling and 11 people in the field who never knew that the coverage they depended on had been one man's decision to climb. I thought about all the ordinary, important, uncelebrated work of keeping things running and people safe in the way that quiet things do, not dramatically, not visibly, but continuously. He thought about Emma. He thought about her sitting across from him at the kitchen table, asking can someone be a hero and still be regular. He thought about what the true answer was. I need to think about it, he said. Garrett nodded. He had expected nothing less. Take the time you need. The offer doesn't expire. Can I ask who reviewed the flag, who made the calls? Garrett smiled slightly. You can ask. You're not going to tell me? No. Daniel looked at him. Then he said, Is it Marsh? Garrett picked up his coffee and said nothing, which was itself an answer. They finished their coffee. They stood and shook hands again, and this time Garrett held the handshake for a moment longer than necessary. You did it right, Garrett said quietly. All of it. The leaving, the building, the staying. He let go. Martinez couldn't do it. A lot of guys can't. You did. Daniel held his gaze. Take care of yourself, Tom, he said. You too, Garrett said. Give Emma my best. He walked out. Daniel stood for a moment. Then he walked back to the maintenance section. Rivera was there. Cho was there. The equipment was logged. The schedule was planned. The trend analysis reports were building their quarterly record. The protocol with his name on it was moving through the base implementation process. He sat down at his desk. He pulled the maintenance schedule toward him. There were 4 units due for review. A power regulation check on the north facility. A calibration update on the eastern range equipment. A follow-up inspection on Tower 6's full coupling series, which he'd added to the rotation himself. He opened the schedule. He began to plan. Because this was the work. This specific, quiet, unglamorous, absolutely essential work of making sure that the systems people depended on were sound. That the things that were supposed to hold would hold. That when someone in the field needed the relay to be there, it was there. That when the diagnostic said clean, it was actually clean, not just on the surface, but in the history, in the trend, in the deep record of what a thing had been doing before anyone thought to look. This was the work. And Daniel Brooks understood in a way that was no longer theory and had become simply true, that there was no such thing as ordinary work done with precision and care and complete attention. There was only the work, and the quality of the person bringing themselves to it. He had spent 9 years in the dark, in cold water, in places that didn't exist, doing things that couldn't be named for reasons that never required explanation, because the reasons were as obvious as breathing. And then he had spent 4 years finding his way back to a life that fit the man he was becoming. And then he had spent 14 months at Fort Calloway, fixing equipment and catching failures and standing still when someone poured a drink on his chest, and doing every piece of it with the same precision he'd brought to everything he'd ever done. And the record of it was in the documentation files, and the trend analysis reports, and the post-operation notes, and the protocol with his name on it, and the minds of the people who had watched him and decided to become better because of what they'd seen. You didn't have to announce what you were. You just had to be it, every day. In the small, real, consequential work of being the person people could count on. That was the whole of it. That was it turned out more than enough.